Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere unexpected, out of the mud, across a horizon you didn't know existed, and straight into the surprisingly mobile feet of a medieval peasant. That's right, you're about to find out that the idea of the dirty, tired serf who never left the village might not be as accurate as you were taught. But let's get one thing straight. If you were a peasant in the 1300s, you probably weren't destined for a long, healthy life. In fact, between famine, disease, and lords who viewed you as property adjacent, you probably won't survive this. Just wanted to set expectations. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments what city you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing where and when you all tune in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's early morning and you're already awake. You didn't sleep on a mattress, not unless you count a burlap sack stuffed with straw as a mattress. There's a hole in the roof that drips whenever it rains. Your breath hangs in the cold air as your mother stokes the fire with a tired hand. The rooster starts its annoying routine about 2 minutes too early, and you hear the soft rustle of animals outside, some of which are technically yours, but really everything on this land belongs to the Lord. You pull your scratchy tunic over your head, feet raw from yesterday's walk to the edge of the fields. You're a peasant. Congratulations. You don't own the land, but you do live on it, work it, and pay a variety of charmingly specific taxes for the privilege, like the one for using the Lord's oven, or the fee for getting married. You're tied to the manor, and people will tell you that means you're stuck here forever. But are you? This muddy village with its maybe 10 houses, one church, a lot of geese, and a deeply suspicious cow named Maribel seems like your whole universe. Your neighbours are mostly extended family, give or take a few generations, and there's a good chance you've never seen a town. But that doesn't mean you never will. In fact, just this month, the Reeve, kind of like the village's glorified snitch manager, mentioned that a group of you might need to walk to the nearby market to sell some surplus turnips. It's 2 days away. 2 whole days of walking, sleeping under carts, and being just a little bit free. Already there's movement. Your older cousin Toma is loading a cart with barrels of ale to take down the road. You hear gossip about a fair in the next village over. Your uncle once went on pilgrimage to Canterbury and still talks about it, even though that was 10 years ago and he came back limping. And wasn't there a girl from the next manor who left to become a servant in the city? These aren't rumours. They're real lives. Real movement. Small, yes, but real. Let's clear something up right now. Medieval peasants weren't some kind of human barnacles. While most people didn't travel far or often, that didn't mean they never travelled at all. Life was hard, achingly, bone-breakingly hard, but also weirdly fluid when it had to be. You had responsibilities, but you weren't literally chained to a fence post. There were marriages that linked villages, work that took you across parishes, pilgrimages that sent you walking across kingdoms. You just had to survive long enough and be lucky enough to do it. And in your village, there's always someone who's seen something more. The old shepherd with the missing fingers tells stories about the coast. The tanner's wife was once a maid in a bishop's house, and your grandmother, half blind now, swears she met a real-life Saracen once, though nobody knows how or why. Even now, as you wipe yesterday's dirt off your face and reach for the same bread and turnip breakfast again, you can feel it. The road is out there. Your feet are meant to touch it at least once. The village might be your home, your duty, your prison, but it's not your whole map. Not necessarily. Historically, the idea that peasants were forever stuck in place comes from a mix of misunderstanding and oversimplification. Yes, serfdom meant that you were bound to the land, on paper, but in reality, that binding had wiggle room. Lords needed labour, but they also needed coin. And if you paid the right fee, or made yourself useful elsewhere, you might be allowed, sometimes even encouraged, to leave. In fact, it wasn't unheard of for a serf to simply disappear into the forest, reappear as a hired hand somewhere new and just stay there. Not legal maybe, but it happened. Here's a fun fringe fact. Some lords actually advertised to attract peasants from other manors by offering better conditions. Think of it like the medieval version of poaching tech talent, but instead of free snacks and stock options, it was less back-breaking labour, and only 2 random tithes instead of 6. Not a bad deal, relatively speaking. And then there's the scholarly debate. Were medieval people really as immobile as we think, or have we just been looking in the wrong places? Some historians argue that while records are sparse, because peasants didn't leave diaries or get recorded in the Grand Chronicles, there's enough anecdotal and local evidence to suggest that movement was more common than previously assumed. Others still insist that such travel was rare, and we're just romanticising the exceptions. The truth? It's probably somewhere in the middle. Like most things in history, it's messier than we'd like. Back in the village, you sling a rough sack over your shoulder. There's talk that a monk is coming through tomorrow, passing from abbey to abbey. You're thinking of asking him questions about the road, about what he's seen, about whether a person like you could go further than just the next parish. The sun is up now, warm but already filtered through autumn mist. Your bare feet press into the dew-covered ground as you head to the fields, but you pause just for a second. You look at the narrow dirt path that leads away from the manor house, past the trees, towards somewhere else. You'll be back in the same field by noon, turning the same soil you always have. But now the idea is in your head, and once it's there, once the concept of somewhere else takes root, it's hard to shake, even for a peasant. You're bent over in the field again, fingers numb in the morning chill, digging stubborn roots from the damp earth. The oxen snort in the distance, steam curling from their broad nostrils, and your cousin Toma is complaining about his back for the third time in an hour. Another day, another patch of soil that refuses to cooperate. And as you straighten up and stretch, eyes on the crooked horizon, you remember something the Reeve said last week, that you and your kin are bound to the land. That's the phrase. Sounds dramatic, doesn't it? Like chains or curses or medieval fairy tales. But what does that actually mean? Well, first off, you're not a slave. Not exactly. You're a serf, legally tied to this lord's manor, which means you can't pack up and leave without permission, at least not on paper. The land and your labour are linked. Your father ploughed this field, your grandfather died in it, and now you're here, presumably to do the same. The term villain might be tossed around when the steward is feeling fancy. It basically means tenant farmer with very few rights. You owe work, taxes and loyalty to the lord, and in return you get to live on his land. You don't own it, you just borrow it. Forever. But here's where it gets murky. Because while the law might say you're bound, life has a funny way of bending rules when it wants to. There's a difference between being legally tied to land and being physically incapable of leaving it. And in practice, medieval peasants did move, through loopholes, by request, or even just by slipping away and hoping no one comes looking. Your neighbour, Alric, for example, he got loaned to a neighbouring manor 3 years ago. Technically, he was still part of this lord's household, but the arrangement had him working fields several miles east, and after a while he just stayed. The lord never really pressed the issue. Why would he? Labour's needed everywhere, and peasants are pretty interchangeable in the eyes of the nobility. As long as someone's tilling the earth and paying dues, nobody looks too closely at where they came from. And don't forget about merchant. That's the charming little tax you have to pay if your daughter wants to marry a man from another manor. Yep, even marriage is taxable, and it's not just a cash grab, it's a mechanism of control. Lords don't want their labour force walking off to other estates. But here's the thing, if your daughter does marry out and the fee is paid, she's gone, moved, relocated, so already there's movement baked into the system, even if it comes with a receipt. There's also the fact that lords weren't stupid. If your entire village gets wiped out by plague, hello Black Death, someone has to work the land. And if that means acquiring a few wayward peasants from a neighbouring manor, so be it. This is where the phrase, "he who does not work, does not eat," gets real. After the 14th century, the labour shortage was so intense that peasants had more leverage than ever before. Suddenly, mobility wasn't just possible, it was profitable. But let's rewind a bit. Before the plague, before the labour crisis, before everything started falling apart, was there really movement? Or are we just romanticising mud-splattered folks with zero travel experience? Because according to some scholars, the idea of total peasant immobility is more a product of 19th century historians than medieval truth. The Victorians, obsessed with order and structure, like to imagine the Middle Ages as this rigid feudal pyramid where everyone stayed in their place. Convenient, right, but not very accurate. Take court records, for example. There are documents that show disputes between lords over runaway serfs, which, surprise, means that serfs ran away. In fact, the fact that laws existed to punish or retrieve fugitives tells you something. This wasn't an unheard of occurrence. It happened often enough to be a problem. Some even had entire families slip away in the night, leaving behind half-finished fields and nosy neighbours with theories. The woods became passageways, the rivers, secret highways, and towns. Towns were chaos, perfect for vanishing into. There's even a fringe theory that the rise of some towns, especially new towns in 12th and 13th century England, was accelerated by these informal migrations, a kind of peasant brain drain, if you will. Historians still argue about it. Some say towns grew from trade and natural expansion. Others say towns were built on the backs of runaways and opportunists, fleeing the plough for the promise of anonymity and a wage. But not everyone who left did so illegally. There were legal paths too. Peasants could ask permission to leave, say to visit a dying relative or deliver goods. Others could strike bargains. Some lords even freed serfs entirely in exchange for service, coin or favour. It wasn't common, but it wasn't unheard of. The lines were blurry, and in those blurs people found a way. Of course, not every attempt ended in freedom. Some who fled were caught and punished, forced back, fined, beaten or branded as troublemakers. But even then, the punishment varied wildly depending on the local lord's temperament. Some turned a blind eye, others made examples, but no one could keep track of every peasant on every acre of land, especially when people started dropping from plagues like flies. Back in your village, it's midday. The sun is directly overhead, and your shirt is damp with sweat. You stop for a break near the trees, eating a rough hunk of bread and a questionable onion. The talk among the field hands today isn't about crops, but about the reeve's daughter. She wants to marry a boy from the next village over, and there's a quiet rumour the two of them are planning to run. No permission, no machie, just disappear. Someone snorts. Someone else says they won't make it 10 miles without being caught. But maybe they will. Maybe they'll slip into a merchant caravan or hide among the pilgrims passing through. Maybe they'll find a town, change their names, and start over. Stranger things have happened. And you, sitting in the shade with dirt under your nails and a belly only half full, you start to wonder, if others can leave, why not you? Is the land truly a cage? Or just something you've never questioned? The mud beneath your feet might feel permanent, but history is full of footprints. Some of them start right where you're sitting now. The first time you hear about the fair, it's from a peddler with a lazy eye and a wagon that smells like pickled onions and goats. He's halfway through trying to sell your aunt a cracked comb and a set of wooden spoons when he lets it slip. There's a big gathering planned in the market town 2 days' walk west. Traders, musicians, animals you've never even seen before. Even a fire breather, he says, waving his hands as if that's a normal part of life. Comes from the south, eats coals, swears by St. Anthony. This might not sound like much, but in your world, a fair is the equivalent of a music festival, shopping mall, and religious gathering all rolled into one. And yes, peasants went to them. Not just once in a lifetime either. Sometimes every year if they could afford the time and the aching knees. You ask your uncle about it later, careful not to seem too eager. He squints at you like he's trying to read your thoughts through your forehead, then shrugs. If the Lord gives permission and the weather holds, we might take some cheese to trade, maybe a duck or two. That's all you need to hear. You're already picturing it. Bright tents, rowdy laughter, food that isn't made of cabbage or rye. Most of all, you're imagining distance. Real distance. 2 days of walking, 40 miles, a pilgrimage in miniature. The idea that medieval peasants never left their village collapses fast when you look at fairs. These weren't just local gatherings. Some were massive regional events, authorised by royal charter and scheduled with military precision. Towns like St Ives, Boston, and Winchester in England hosted annual events that drew people from 100 miles away or more. Whole families would prepare for weeks, making goods to sell, packing food, figuring out how to survive the journey there and back. You'd have to ask the reeve for time off. That usually meant a few extra days of labour the week before to compensate, and maybe a good story to go along with your request. The last batch of cheese needs a higher-paying buyer, you might say. There's a blessed relic passing through town too. Could be good luck. You have to make it sound like a duty, not a vacation. Medieval bosses, much like modern ones, don't love the idea of you taking time to relax. When you finally go, the road feels like a revelation. Dusty, yes. Full of flies and wagon ruts, also yes. But it's movement. You walk beside neighbours and distant cousins, everyone hauling small carts, sacks of grain or fidgety children. Your feet hurt by mile 5. By mile 10, you're wondering if the fair is actually real or just some kind of collective mirage. Then you see the tents on the horizon. Bright splashes of red and green, flags snapping in the breeze, and the smell hits you like a holy vision. Roasting meat, sweat, hay, and cinnamon. Cinnamon, which you've only ever smelled in church incense. It's like the world got bigger while you weren't looking. Inside the fairgrounds, it's sensory chaos. A man is juggling knives while yelling about turnips. A goat wanders past with coloured ribbons braided into its fur. You spot a monk standing in front of a cart, arguing about the price of dried figs. And then there's the music. Drums, flutes, voices rising in 100 overlapping songs. Your head spins. It's glorious. You might trade some goods, sure, but there's more to this than commerce. Fairs were social hubs. People found spouses here, negotiated deals, hired themselves out for seasonal work. You might even get lucky and see a royal official or a knight riding through, armour gleaming in the sun like a character out of a legend. You won't speak to them, obviously, but you'll remember the sight forever. And don't be surprised if you pick up news. The fair is where you hear about wars, plagues, new taxes, and which lord's been excommunicated. It's like tuning into the medieval version of Twitter, but with more livestock and fewer trolls. This is also where gossip thrives. A woman tells your aunt that a distant cousin joined a merchant crew and sailed to Flanders. A tanner boasts about walking all the way to York for a saint's day. You file these stories away like precious coins. Proof that the world stretches further than the tree line. Fairs weren't just for villagers either. Nobles attended too, but for different reasons. Investments, land deals, horse trading. You might catch sight of a well-dressed woman with a veil that costs more than your entire household. You might lock eyes with a scribe carrying a scroll that he guards like treasure. These moments stick. Later, in the quiet mud of home, you'll replay them like dreams. And here's a quirky little slice of fair history for you. In some places, they held what were called mock courts. Half-legal, half-comic performances where people could sue each other for silly things. Imagine a local farmer dragging his goat before a clownish judge and accusing it of theft or gluttony. All in good fun, of course, usually. But amidst all this bustle, there's also danger. Pickpockets thrive in the crowd. Fights break out, especially after ale's been flowing for a few hours. You might see someone dragged away by local guards, accused of selling spoiled meat or fake relics. And if you're unlucky enough to be carrying something valuable, you'll guard it like your life depends on it, because it might. Scholars still debate how far people really travelled to reach these fairs. Some argue that the distances were exaggerated, romanticised later by chroniclers. Others insist that fair records and trade logs prove wide-ranging movement, even among the lower classes. The real answer, again, is probably somewhere in between. Some came from miles away, some from the next village. But even if you walk just 10 miles, that's 10 more than the stereotype gives you credit for. When the fair ends, you trudge home with sore legs and a head full of new sounds, smells and images. Your aunt is humming a tune she learned from a travelling fiddler. Your cousin has a crude wooden flute he swears he can learn to play. You yourself carry a small cloth pouch with 3 dried plums, your first taste of sweetness that isn't made of boiled root. You'll savour them over the next week like they're royal treasure. And somewhere in that journey home, under a setting sun and a sky that feels impossibly huge, you realise something important. You weren't just allowed to travel. You did. Your feet touched roads you didn't know existed. You saw things that rewrote your understanding of the world, and that memory will feed something in you. Something restless, curious, hard to name. Back in your village, nothing looks different. Same thatch roofs, same cracked pots, same geese causing low-level chaos. But you're different. You've seen a wider circle now, and once your world expands, even a little, it never quite shrinks back to what it was. You're stacking firewood behind your house when you hear the bells, not your local chapel's usual clanging either. This is deeper, slower, with a rhythm that makes your spine twitch. You glance down the path and see a small line of figures coming up over the hill, walking with purpose, their robes catching the breeze like sails. Pilgrims. You know the look. There's always a staff, a scallop shell, maybe a scrap of cloth pinned to a shoulder that once touched a relic. One of them even has a badge shaped like a tiny hand. You're not sure which saint it's meant to represent, but you've heard tales about hands that heal and hands that curse. It's hard to tell which kind you're dealing with until it's too late. Your aunt emerges from the cottage, squinting. On their way to Walsingham, she murmurs, as if naming a mythical place. She offers a half loaf of bread to the passing group, and one of them nods in gratitude. You stare at their dusty boots, cracked lips. the way their eyes are both exhausted and oddly lit up. It hits you then that they've walked here from who knows where, through rain and blistering sun, along roads thick with mud and strangers, and they're going even farther. Pilgrimage. That's the real travel story of the medieval peasant. You might be too poor to afford a horse or a real map, but if your soul needs saving, or if you just need an excuse to leave, you can walk to a shrine. And in doing so, you become part of one of the most widespread travel phenomena of the entire medieval period. Now don't get confused. Pilgrimage wasn't just for nobility or monks. Sure, the rich could go all out, bring an entourage, ride comfortably, lodge in monasteries, but peasants? They pilgrimed in the dirt with bad shoes and hollow stomachs for days or even months at a time. Not because it was easy, because it mattered, because sometimes it was the only way out of your tiny repetitive life. You've probably heard of Canterbury, thanks to a certain poet who couldn't resist putting 30 loudmouths on a road trip and calling it literature. But that wasn't the only destination. There was Santiago de Compostela in Spain, famous for the bones of St. James. There was Rome. There was even Jerusalem, though for a peasant that was more dream than destination, considering the cost and, the minor detail of surviving the trip through Crusader territory. But even closer to home, there were dozens of local shrines. St. Cuthbert in Durham, St. Edmund in Bury, tiny chapels clinging to cliffs, rumoured to perform miracles if you prayed there hard enough, or just walked there with enough blisters to prove your devotion. You didn't need to go far to go somewhere. And here's the kicker. People didn't always go alone. Pilgrimage routes often became impromptu communities, groups forming on the road for safety, company, or shared purpose. You could join one of these bands, follow the river paths, sleep in barns or under hedges, eat whatever someone gave you. And yes, you might die. But you also might live more fully than you ever had. You're already imagining it now. How your mother would react if you told her you wanted to walk to a holy site. She'd raise a spoon and point it like a weapon. And who's going to till the fields while you chase ghosts, But if you said it was for a vow, maybe you or someone you love was sick, or you needed forgiveness, she might sigh, nod slowly, and pack you some dried peas. There's an open scholarly debate about how accessible pilgrimage really was to lower-class people. Some historians argue that most peasants couldn't afford the time off or the risk. Others point to surviving pilgrimage badges found in rural areas as evidence that it did happen, and regularly. You know what's funny? Most of those badges are cheap, mass-produced lead trinkets, proof that pilgrimage wasn't some elite Instagrammable vacation. It was for everyone, even if what you brought home was a pewter brooch shaped like a saint's nose. And let's not forget the fringe facts. There's at least one documented case of a pig being brought on pilgrimage. No, not for eating. As a pilgrim. Apparently its owner claimed the pig had been healed by St. Edmund and wanted to give thanks. The pig wore a little bell and everything. People stared. The pig didn't care. Frankly, it had a better attitude than half the humans on the road. But pilgrimage wasn't all candles and prayer. It had rules. The church liked to supervise the practice, especially once it got popular and profitable. In some places, you needed a letter from your priest to prove you weren't just running away. If you were a known troublemaker or debtor, you might be denied the right to go entirely. And some lords didn't appreciate losing their labour force to what they considered glorified sightseeing. Still, people went. For faith. For curiosity. For community. For penance. And sometimes, let's be honest, just to get out of town. The road offered a break in the cycle. A breath of air beyond the same 4 muddy walls. You might meet someone, hear a new song, see the sea for the first time. There were even travelling minstrels and entertainers who piggybacked on pilgrimage routes, knowing full well that a tired pilgrim with a coin to spare might want to laugh more than another sermon. Back in your village, the line of pilgrims disappears over the far hill. You don't follow, not this time. But that idea, it lingers. Pilgrimage isn't just a trip, it's a possibility. It's a future you didn't know you were allowed to imagine. And maybe, just maybe, that scallop shell badge could look good on your own shoulder one day. For now, you go back to stacking firewood. Your hands move automatically, but your mind is miles down the road. Among chanting voices and candlelight, you see yourself walking in a crowd of strangers, becoming someone else for a little while. A traveller, a witness, a speck moving slowly across the map. Because even peasants, it turns out, sometimes walk towards something holy, or at least, away from something dull. You hear them before you see them. rattling cartwheels, clinking harness buckles, the low murmur of animals and men. Then the first of them passes down the muddy path that splits your village in two. A man with sun-creased skin, leading a donkey loaded with sacks. Behind him comes another, this one younger, with a crooked hat and a string of dried fish swaying behind his back like some kind of scaly battle trophy. A third follows, driving a rickety cart filled with clay jugs, and just behind that, a grinning woman hawking ribbons and combs from a tray slung over her shoulders. Merchants, they travel and then they talk. A lot. This is how you learn things. You lean against the fence post, pretending to fix a strap on your sandal while your ears do all the real work. One of them is heading to a town near the coast, where salt is cheap and people eat oysters for fun. Another complains that a bridge was out 3 villages west, and he had to ferry his goods across a river by raft, nearly losing a goat in the process. You can't tell if he's joking. Honestly, with travelling merchants, half of it could be made up and you'd still eat it up like warm porridge. Here's something no one tells you when you're learning about medieval peasants. They didn't all stay peasants forever. Some of them side hustled their way out of serfdom, one market at a time. It wasn't common, it wasn't easy, but it happened. Let's say you're good with your hands, really good. Maybe you make baskets tighter than anyone else in the village, or you carve wooden spoons that don't snap in the soup. One day, someone passing through offers you a few coins for your work. You trade, they leave, but they tell others. Soon, more people come. Eventually you decide, why wait for them to come to me? And so you go, just to the next village at first, then farther. Eventually you're walking regular circuits, spring markets here, autumn fairs there. You learn to time your steps with the planting and harvest seasons so your absence doesn't cause too much disruption back home. Or maybe, if you're bold and slightly fed up, you don't come back at all. There's an idea, mostly pushed by earlier historians, that trade was the realm of townspeople and guild members only. But reality says otherwise. Plenty of rural folks got involved in petty trade, carrying extra eggs, herbs, yarn, or wooden goods to nearby towns or fairs. You didn't need a license to carry a sack of onions. You just needed stamina, a bit of charm, and the ability to walk long distances while convincing people that your cabbage is better than the next guy's cabbage. Of course, there were risks. You could be fined if caught trading without permission, especially if you were technically still tied to a manor. Some lords got huffy about their peasants making coin on the side. Others looked the other way, especially if you paid a little extra in the form of goods or favours. The line between peasant and peddler was muddy, literally. There's a lesser-known debate among scholars about the economic agency of peasants, how much control they actually had over their livelihoods. Some argue that manorial records show surprising levels of side income from craft and trade. Others say those examples are rare and don't reflect the majority. Either way, it's clear that movement and trade were happening at levels higher than the traditional mud-locked serf narrative implies. And then you've got the real legends, the ones who started as peasants but ended up full-blown merchants. These are the outliers, the son of a carpenter who sells horses in 3 counties, the alewife who ends up with enough silver to buy herself out of bondage. Some towns even had bylaws that said if you lived there a year and a day without being claimed by a lord, you became a free person. So, technically, all you had to do was run, hide in plain sight, sell enough apples and keep your head down for 12 months. Easy, right? Fringe fact of the night. There's a recorded case from the 13th century France of a former peasant who made his fortune selling eels. Yep, slippery, wriggling swamp noodles. Apparently he knew the perfect marshes and had a system for transporting them in barrels packed with wet moss. He cornered a niche market and made enough money to buy a small home in a market town and marry a widow with 2 chickens and a roof that didn't leak. Peasant to ill baron, truly inspiring. You imagine this now as you watch the last of the traders pass. You wonder what it would be like to have no land to answer to, no crops to fail you. Just you, a bag of carved spoons and the open road, no guaranteed food, no fixed roof, but also no boundaries. You head back into your home and glance around the one-room structure you know like your own breath. Everything here is familiar, safe, expected, and a little suffocating. You pick up a small scrap of cloth you've been working on, threaded with tiny embroidered patterns, and you think, maybe someone in the next village would pay for this. Maybe that's how it starts. Peasant life isn't only about obedience and stagnation. Sometimes it's about small moments of ingenuity. You take what you're good at, what the land gave you, and you make it into something portable, profitable. The village might own your hours, but it doesn't always own your ambition. That night, the fire cracks in the hearth and you listen to the wind outside. You imagine it carrying news from far-off places, salt from the sea, wool from the hills, spices from the east. You picture your feet, cracked and tired, pounding those same roots, your name passed from mouth to mouth. That's the girl who sells the good thread. You want hers, not the other, and maybe someday, a child in a village you've never seen leans against a fence post watching you go by. There's a story your grandmother tells when the nights get long and the wind creeps under the door like it's looking for toes to gnaw. It's always the same setup. A boy with a good singing voice, clever fingers and not much else goes to the abbey downriver to help with harvest, and ends up working in the kitchens. But then the monks hear him sing while he's chopping onions, and before you know it, he's copying manuscripts in the scriptorium, learning Latin, getting fat off fish stew and honeyed oats, and eventually, becoming a priest. They gave him a new name, she whispers, as if it's the climax of the tale. Brother Matthias. You've heard this story so many times it should have lost its magic, but somehow it hasn't. Because even if it's only half true, if the boy never made it past onion duty, it still holds a seed of something real. For peasants, the church wasn't just a place to pray, it was a door, not wide open, not welcoming to everyone, but there, a way out, a way through. You think about that now as you walk past the village chapel, a small stone building with a leaning cross and a patchy roof. Father Odo's inside, muttering to himself and rearranging candles that seem determined to fall over. He's not exactly inspiring, his breath always smells like leeks, and he dozes off mid-sermon. But he was once a peasant too. That part everyone knows. Born to a swineherd, sent to the abbey after he lost 2 toes to frostbite and couldn't farm anymore. He still walks with a limp, but he walks, and more importantly, he reads, he writes, he knows things. You linger by the door, pretending to fix your shoe, listening to the low sound of Latin filtering through the stone. It feels like another language, a spell, and for a moment, you wonder what your name would sound like with a brother or sister in front of it. The church, as it turns out, was one of the few institutions in medieval Europe where a peasant might change their stars. You could join as a monk, a nun, a lay brother, or even just as a hired hand with good manners and better timing. Monasteries were not just places of worship, they were self-sufficient hubs of agriculture, learning, healing and hospitality. And they needed people. Lots of them. Not just scholars and priests, but shepherds, brewers, millers, cooks, scribes, gardeners, and yes, singers who could chop onions. If you made yourself useful, if you stayed quiet and worked hard, you could climb, slowly, cautiously, but upward. Some abbots, rare ones, but they existed, rose from humble beginnings. A few even advised kings. Of course, you'd have to give up most worldly things, no marriage, no children, no personal wealth. But let's be honest, how much of that do you have now? And it wasn't just about climbing. The church moved people. Monks travelled between abbeys, they went on missions, carried messages, collected rents. They saw roads that peasants weren't supposed to walk and talked with people peasants weren't supposed to meet. If you could worm your way into that system, even as the lowest cog, your feet might take you far. There's a quirky but true detail about Benedictine monasteries. Many kept guest houses open to travellers, especially other members of the clergy. That means peasants attached to these places often interacted with people from across the realm, even beyond. You could overhear stories of crusades, kingdoms, storms at sea, or giant vegetables in Flanders. Your world expanded one overheard conversation at a time. Of course, the church wasn't some magical utopia. Power plays happened behind altars. Some monks were cruel, some convents were prisons with hymns, and entry was often limited to those who brought a dowry, a connection, or at least a clean reputation. But loopholes existed. If you were orphaned, injured, unusually bright, or just very lucky, someone might let you in, especially if they thought you had potential, or could work without complaining. There's also scholarly debate around how accessible monastic life really was for the peasantry. Some argue that the doors were firmly shut without the right money or patron. Others point to records of novices from rural backgrounds, especially after plagues or wars depleted numbers. It's hard to say exactly how often the poor joined, but it's clear they did. Enough to feed the legends, enough to inspire bedtime stories whispered over straw mattresses. You watch as Father Odo stumbles outside, startled by a goat chewing on his cassock. He shoos it off with a half-hearted curse, then notices you. Thinking of joining the cloth, he grumbles, squinting into the sun. You smile, shake your head, and say something vague. He doesn't press. He just mutters about the roof again and hobbles off, trailing bits of straw. But even that brief exchange lingers, because you had been thinking about it. Not seriously, not yet. But it's one of the few visible paths out of the fields that doesn't involve running away or marrying a stranger. It's a slow path, a quiet one, but it's real. Later, while helping your mother grind barley, you bring it up casually. Didn't Great-Aunt Iselle become a nun? She nods, distracted, then adds, but only after her third husband died, and she still smuggled wine into the convent if the rumours are true. That somehow makes it better. You fall asleep that night with Gregorian chants in your head, mixing with the rustle of leaves and the distant bleat of sheep. You dream of cloisters and candlelight, ink-stained fingers and hushed footsteps on stone. You see a long row that starts in a tiny village and ends somewhere bright. It's not your path, not yet, maybe never, but it exists, and for a peasant that's more than most people think. You wake to shouting, not the usual argument over whose goose wandered into whose garden, but something sharper, more urgent. You scramble to your feet and peek outside. There's a man at the edge of the village, helmet askew, armour battered, horse limping, barking orders like he owns the place. Beside him, 2 soldiers with spears stand guard over a pile of scrolls and lists, and just like that, you know what's coming. The levy. The king's war machine has found your village again, and this time it's hungry for bodies. Conscription isn't exactly new. Every few years, someone with a crown or a grudge decides they need more men to go fight other men somewhere you've never heard of. Normandy, Scotland, Wales. You barely know what's 5 miles outside your village, let alone which direction Normandy lies in. But none of that matters. If your name is called, you're going. And no one asks if you want to. You huddle with your neighbours, waiting for the steward to read the list aloud. He pauses at every name, chewing it like he's deciding whether to say it or swallow it. Alric, son of Wulfric, gone. Toma, of the lower field, gone. You feel your stomach twist when your cousin grips your arm. If they call me, he whispers, tell my mother I want the dog. You nod, because what else do you say? When your name isn't called, you feel 2 things at once, overwhelming relief and a strange flicker of guilt. You're spared, for now. But those who are chosen, they'll be on the road tomorrow, trudging towards some battlefield that smells of sweat, iron, and dying dreams. It's easy to think of peasants as static, unmoving. But war moved them, frequently, and not just the willing. Kings relied heavily on conscripted labour, bowmen, foot soldiers, supply train drivers, baggage handlers. Most didn't have armour, many didn't even have shoes. You'd get a polearm, a scrap of cloth with a crest on it, and a promise that if you survived you'd come home a hero. Spoiler, most didn't. Still, war was a form of travel, brutal and unforgiving though it was. Some peasants saw France, or parts of it anyway. Muddy fields, burned-out towns, castles that looked like something out of a dream, and not the good kind. Others were marched across the Scottish borders into lands where the wind carried accents so thick you could barely tell if they were words or curses. And the irony? Some who were taken never came back because they didn't want to. They deserted, disappeared into new towns, started new lives. Yes, it was illegal, dangerous, but it happened. And in that terrifying chaos of wartime with lords dead and paperwork lost, who was going to stop them? There's even a fringe theory, held by a few overly optimistic scholars, that war acted as an engine of accidental social mobility. The idea is that a particularly skilled archer or brave footman might be knighted, or at least rewarded, maybe given land. But here's the truth. That was rare. Mostly peasants got glory in the form of a slightly slower death and a wooden grave marker that said, some guy who died screaming. Still, war changed things, even for those who came back. They returned leaner, quieter, with new scars, sometimes with a strange accent or a limp, or a pendant from a shrine they stopped at along the road. They talked about things you couldn't imagine. A siege that lasted 6 weeks, a river full of bloated horses, a woman in Gascony who made bread with rosemary and salt. And even if the war had broken them, their stories shifted the village's imagination. You'd gather around the fire to hear what Normandy looked like at sunset, or how Welsh forests whispered at night. Suddenly, The map in your head wasn't just your manor, your church and the sky. It was bigger, stranger, bloodier. There's a scholarly debate, ongoing, dusty and full of footnotes, about how much peasants participated in war. Some claim it was mostly freemen or town militias who were called up. Others argue that the line between freeman and wealthy peasant was thin enough that it often included your average farmhand with 2 good arms. The muster rolls don't lie. Peasants fought, in large numbers, often reluctantly, but sometimes with an odd sort of pride. And war didn't only move men. Women were dragged along too. Wives of soldiers, camp followers, washerwomen, nurses. They travelled with the armies, setting up and tearing down makeshift villages in the shadow of every campaign. These weren't pampered noble ladies. They were sharp-tongued, resourceful, and usually carrying more than one screaming toddler on their hip. One of them might have more miles under her belt than your entire bloodline. Fringe fact of the night. There's a known case of a peasant woman named Agnes Hoto who, after her father fell ill before a duel, disguised herself in his armour, rode out, and won the fight. Her opponent reportedly found out when her helmet fell off during the victory lap. Whether that story's entirely true or just medieval tabloid fuel, it shows something important. Peasants weren't passive. They got dragged into history's messes all the time, and sometimes they hit back. As the levy marches out the next morning, you stand beside your cousin's mother and watch the soldiers disappear down the misty road. You see Alric trying to look brave, Toma clutching a bundle of food like it might shield him from arrows, the Reeve's son already weeping. They vanish one by one into the trees. You don't envy them, not exactly. But something strange blooms in your chest, the bitter ache of being left behind, of not knowing what's out there. You go back to your work. The field is quiet without the usual complaints and singing, but your ears ring with new questions. What if the road brought you somewhere better? What if war, for all its horror, was also a door? For a peasant, the choice was rarely yours to make. But once taken, once moved, your feet didn't forget the path, and neither did your soul. There's a path that runs just behind the churchyard, barely wide enough for a cart, hemmed in by brambles, half swallowed by weeds. Nobody talks about it much, not because it's secret, but because it makes people uneasy. That's the path they say she took, the girl from the upper cottage, the one with the pale eyes and too many questions. One day she was here, milking her family's goats, the next, gone. Left with a satchel and a single shoe, if the rumours are to be believed, and just like that she became another village mystery. She ran, some say. She was taken, others whisper. But everyone agrees on one thing. She left. No permission, no papers, no blessing from the Reeve or the priest. Just up and vanished. You think about her sometimes, especially when the wind carries the scent of wood smoke from far away. It's not unheard of, after all, peasants running. Slipping out under the veil of night, hearts pounding, each step a gamble. It's not freedom in the clean, noble sense. It's escape. Desperate, breathless, and more common than people like to admit. We've been trained to picture the medieval peasant as endlessly obedient, too cowed by law and religion to disobey. But the truth? They ran. Not in massive waves, not every day, but often enough that there are laws about it. Entire chunks of legal texts obsessed with the retrieval of fugitive serfs, because serfdom wasn't a tight chain. It was more like a leash, and when no one was looking, people slipped the collar and bolted. Why? For 100 reasons. Sometimes it was love, a forbidden match across manor lines, or a marriage refused by a lord who didn't want to lose valuable labour. Sometimes it was abuse, a cruel steward, a violent family member, a lord who didn't understand no. Other times, it was simple restlessness. You worked, you gave, you tithed, you bent your back to 100 duties and still went hungry. One day, you just couldn't anymore. So you walked. You didn't go to the nearest town. That would be too easy to track. Instead, you aimed for a place just far enough. Across a river, through a forest, maybe over a hill people said was haunted. There, you might find another village in need of hands. If you kept your head down and your story straight, they might not ask questions. People didn't carry identification after all. Names were slippery. You could be that boy from the south, and no one would know the difference. Of course, it wasn't that simple. There were risks. If you were caught, you could be fined, beaten, dragged back in chains. Your new village might get punished for harbouring you. But enforcement was spotty. Lords had other things to worry about. Wars, taxes, whether their second cousin was trying to poison them with spoiled pears. They didn't always send someone after a runaway. Still, the fear lingered. There's even a term, infang thief, for the right of a lord to execute a thief caught on his land. If you ran and stole something on your way out, a cloak, a loaf of bread, you could end up swinging from a tree. That's not metaphor, that's history. And yet people still did it. Which tells you something important. The conditions of village life for some were worse than the unknown. People don't abandon everything unless the everything feels like a prison. There's a scholarly argument around how much of this running actually happened. Some records suggest it was rare and harshly punished. Others suggest that, in the right time and place, it was surprisingly common and quietly tolerated, especially in times of labour shortage. After the Black Death, for example, whole manors were deserted. Lords needed workers more than workers needed lords. That gave peasants power. Not noble power, but negotiating power. Mobility became leverage. You pause by the edge of the field and glance back at that overgrown path again. The brambles have grown thicker, but you can still see where the footprints used to fall. Deep grooves where cartwheels dug in. A smooth patch from countless cloaks dragging over time. It's a ghost road, really, full of stories no one finishes. You once asked your grandmother what happened to the pale-eyed girl. She only shrugged. Could have gone to the city, could have died in a ditch, but at least she went. That answer stuck with you. Not because it was comforting, but because it was honest. And you know what? Not all runners ran alone. Some took lovers, some took children, some planned for months, quietly trading favours for supplies. There are tales of entire families disappearing under cover of fog. One peasant boy supposedly hid in a travelling puppet wagon and made it all the way to York. Another, more dubious tale says a man disguised himself as a nun to slip past guards. You don't know if it's true, but you want it to be. You wonder what it would take for you to run. Not yet, but maybe someday. When the levy comes again, when the reeve pushes too far, when winter bites harder than usual. Maybe you'd find that hidden courage. Or maybe you'd just wait, quietly, for the right moment, your satchel already packed in your dreams. There's a fringe case from 14th century Germany where a runaway peasant, after years in hiding, actually sued his old lord for past abuse. It didn't go well. He lost, was fined, and reportedly ran again. But still, he tried. The record exists. That's the thing about runaways. Even if the law didn't love them, the story did. They became legends, symbols of defiance, of possibility. And for a fellow peasant, stuck in the churn of the same dawn-to-dusk struggle, they were proof that somebody broke the pattern, that the leash had a weak spot. You sit in the grass now watching dusk settle across the field. Your hands are sore, your knees ache, but your mind, it's racing. Somewhere out beyond the trees someone else is walking tonight. A girl with a stolen cloak, a boy with a carved flute in his belt, a former peasant pretending to be a stonemason. They're risking it all for a chance at something new. And you stay, for now. But you keep your eyes open, you watch the road, and you remember the names of the ones who left. Because sometimes the most radical kind of travel isn't across oceans or mountains, it's away from the life everyone says you have to live. There's a wedding in the village today, which means several things. The air smells like smoke and roasted leeks. Your cousin is drunk by noon, and someone, likely the smith's apprentice, has already split his tunic doing a dance he doesn't know the steps to. You watch all of this from the edge of the green, chewing a bit of honey bread and trying to ignore the way the sheep are heckling the ceremony from the next field over. It's chaos, in that joyful, barely held together way that village weddings always are. But beneath the laughter and spilled ale, something important is happening. Someone is moving. Literally. The bride, Rilke, whose dowry included 3 hens, a pair of boots, and a goat that can't be trusted, is leaving your village. She's marrying into the next one over, 5 miles north, and after today she's their problem. Her family's already paid the merchant, the lord's delightful little marriage tax, and she'll be carted off tomorrow with her new husband and whatever belongings she can tie together with string. And that, believe it or not, is one of the most common forms of peasant travel. Marriage, not pilgrimages, not fairs, not wars, just good old-fashioned matrimony. People think peasants didn't move, but they did, especially when love, or livestock, was involved. Village endogamy, the habit of marrying within your community, was common, sure, but it wasn't absolute. Sometimes there were just too many cousins, or not enough teeth. So you looked to the next village over, or the one beyond that. Maybe your aunt had a connection. Maybe your family had land to leverage. Or maybe someone saw someone at a fair and thought, hey, they have all their fingers. That's rare. Marriage in that sense became a bridge. You moved for it. You sent messages. You walked across muddy tracks in your best tunic to convince someone's father that your 2 pigs and a good work ethic made you suitable. It wasn't always romantic, let's not fool ourselves, but it was movement. A foot in another place. A reason to cross boundaries. There's a tradition around here, probably older than your grandparents', where the bride walks to her new home on the day after the wedding, carrying a basket of her family's soil. So she never forgets where she came from, someone always says, even though half the time it's just used to patch the roof. Still, it's symbolic. She goes, she leaves, and her absence shifts the shape of your world. You think of Rilke now, glowing and flushed, spinning barefoot in the grass. She's the first of your generation to marry out. There'll be tears in the morning, loud goodbyes, maybe a goat that refuses to follow instructions. But once she's gone, she's gone. Visits are rare, letters rarer. The occasional message passed through a peddler or a priest maybe. But life gets busy. People settle, and within a few years she'll be someone the children hear about in stories. Your cousin? The one who married into Hearthwick? The one who made honey cakes? Yes, her. It's easy to romanticize it, but not all these marriages were smooth. Some peasants, especially women, moved to escape bad homes, worse fathers, or dangerous lords. A new village might offer a new start. Others married into uncertainty. If your husband died before the first harvest, you might find yourself widowed in a strange place, dependent on in-laws you barely knew. Some returned home, if they could. Others didn't, or weren't allowed to. There's an actual record from 1327 of a peasant woman named Isabel, who married into a manor 5 miles away, then tried to return home after her husband vanished on a fishing trip, and presumably became fish food. Her original lord refused her re-entry without a hefty fee. She ended up living on the edge of a forest, working odd jobs, and eventually remarrying a charcoal burner. Her story pops up in legal records as a dispute over who owned her labour. Romantic? No, but real. That's the thing. Once you moved, you didn't just switch houses. You switched lords, switched loyalties. In some ways, you became someone else. A new village meant new rhythms, new gossip, new rules. You might be welcomed warmly, or eyed suspiciously as an outsider for years. It was a gamble, but sometimes it was worth it. In some cases, moving through marriage opened doors. You might gain access to better land, a less tyrannical lord, or, let's be honest, a family with better food. And yes, sometimes there was actual affection involved. Not often, but enough to keep hope alive. There's an open debate among historians about how far peasants move for marriage. Some argue that most unions stayed within a 10-mile radius. Others, digging through manorial court rolls and cross-referencing tax records like medieval detectives, find evidence of spouses travelling 30, even 50 miles. Was that common? Probably not. But possible? Absolutely. Especially if you had something worth travelling for. Beauty, land, a better life, or just the promise of something different. And here's a fringe fact for tonight. In some parts of medieval France, there were matchmaking festivals where eligible young people from neighbouring villages would gather for feasts, dances, and borderline awkward staring contests. Think of it as speed dating, except it's just dancing until someone's mother yells, "That one has sturdy calves!" And yes, couples did end up marrying from these events. Love, or at least mutual tolerance, sometimes found a way. Back at the wedding, the music gets louder, and someone is now standing on a barrel playing the bagpipes with more enthusiasm than skill. You step away from the crowd and look toward the northern path, the one Rilke will take tomorrow. It's not far, just a few miles, but it's another world. You wonder who else will leave in the coming years. You wonder if you will. Because for peasants, travel didn't always mean packs and pilgrimages. Sometimes it meant vows and veils, a walk with your hand in someone else's, a cart full of dowry and dried apples, a goodbye you never knew would be permanent. And even if the new place looked a lot like the old, fields, sheep, grumpy neighbours, you were still new, changed, a traveller with a reason. The music fades behind you as you head home, the stars blinking overhead. You can already see tomorrow, the tearful farewell, the jokes, the uneven cartwheel squeaking into the distance. Rilke's path is made, yours still waits. But one thing is certain. Peasants moved, for love, for goats, for the chance to begin again. And if it took a wedding to get you there, well, better start learning the bagpipe. The frost came early this year. By the time you're out in the fields, the ground is already stiff underfoot, and your breath rises in soft, smoky curls. You wrap your cloak tighter, fingers aching from the cold, and glance toward the woods. There's movement at the tree line, just a figure with a pack, head down, walking with that steady, mile-eating pace you've come to recognise. Another one, your uncle mutters beside you, leaning on his hoe. Looking for work, no doubt. And he's probably right. The harvest was bad across the region, not just here, everywhere. You've heard the whispers, blight in the barley, rot in the root cellars, lords tightening grain rations like it's a game. People are moving again, not for war, not for marriage, but for survival. These are the wanderers, the drifters, the seasonal workers who move from village to village with tools strapped to their backs and nothing but stories in their mouths. They're not vagabonds, not yet, but they ride the edge of stability, always chasing the next meal, the next roof, the next chance to make it through winter without turning to bark soup. You see more of them lately. Men with rough hands and eyes that scan every corner of a new place. Women with children in tow, hoping someone needs help with weaving or spinning. Young boys trying to pass for older, offering to chop wood in exchange for a crust of bread. They come quietly, sleep in barns or lean-tos and disappear just as fast. And here's the thing, most of them used to be just like you, tied to a village, a field, a name in a ledger. But something broke. Maybe their lord died and the manor collapsed. Maybe plague came and took half the workers. Maybe there was a bad debt or a worse marriage, and instead of staying and starving, they walked. Some seasonal workers follow the rhythms of the land. In spring, they head north where the planting starts later. In summer, they find villages behind on repairs. In autumn, they arrive just in time for the harvest, strong arms, silent mouths, ready to work. No questions asked, no answers given. Then winter comes, and they scatter like birds, hoping to roost somewhere with a hearth and no wolves. It's not a glamorous life, but it's a mobile one, and if you're smart, if you watch and learn, it can be survivable. You remember one man from a few years ago, name forgotten, who showed up with nothing but a basket of bone tools and a grin like he'd seen the other side of the world. He mended sickles faster than anyone you'd ever seen, made charms too, carved little animals that the children carried like talismans, stayed 3 weeks, then vanished. Left behind a rumour that he was once a monk or a thief or both. But what stuck with you was how far he'd been. Saw the sea once, he'd said, holding a rusty nail like it was sacred. Smelled like dead fish and freedom. There's a scholarly debate about how structured this seasonal work really was. Some say it was mostly local, 10 miles here, 15 there, just enough to be useful, not enough to threaten the manorial system. Others argue there was a whole hidden economy of travelling peasants who formed informal networks, knowing which villages were generous, which lords overlooked paperwork, which roads were safest. An underground map drawn only in stories and memory. And in years like this one, cold, lean, uncertain, that knowledge becomes everything. Today, after your chores are done, you see one of the wanderers near the granary speaking with the steward. She's young, maybe 16, with a basket slung over one shoulder and a dagger tied at her waist with a bit of rope. She keeps her back straight, voice low, posture respectful, but you can see the hunger in her eyes, the exhaustion in her bones. She's allowed to stay the night in the storage shed, and in exchange she'll help patch a section of thatch roof tomorrow. You bring her a bit of stew, even though it means less for you. She nods, accepts it wordlessly, and eats like someone who's learned not to savour, just to get it down. When she finally speaks, her voice is rough. Came from the east. Fields there are dust. You ask if she has family. She just shakes her head. You don't ask again. Later, as you lie in your own straw bed, belly only half full, you think about her. About all the feet passing in the dark. You imagine the road as a long ribbon, winding through frost-covered hills and sleeping villages, carrying the weary and the willing alike. You wonder what it's like to live like that. To never quite belong anywhere, but also never be trapped. You're still technically a villain, bound to this manor, to this lord, to this life. But you also know the rules bend when the world shifts. And right now, the world is shifting. Hunger does that. It cracks open the walls and lets the wanderers in. Not everyone sees them kindly. Some call them thieves, vagrants, a threat. There are laws now in some places. branding marks for sturdy beggars, forced labour sentences, penalties for sheltering strangers. The powers that be don't like movement they can't track. They fear instability. But the land doesn't care. It opens when it must. It lets people walk. Here's a fringe fact to chew on. In parts of medieval Eastern Europe, whole villages were sometimes emptied out by famine or war, and nearby lords would advertise for settlers, peasants willing to come and repopulate the area in exchange for better rights, lower rents, or even personal freedom. Migration by desperation, incentivized by tragedy. It wasn't heroic, but it was real. You wake in the early hours before dawn. The sky's violet and the frost has crept into your boots. The girl is already gone, shed door cracked open, her footprints leading down the same path the sun will rise on. She took nothing, left no name, but she carved a memory into the mud, and maybe one day when the winter gets too long or the Lord demands too much, your own feet will follow hers. Because for some peasants, travel isn't a choice. It's the only way left to keep going. You remember the story because it didn't make sense, not at first. It was told by your great-uncle during a long winter evening, when the fire was low and the stew was mostly water. He spoke of his cousin, the miller's son, who left the village when he was just 12, wandered off with a group of monks and somehow ended up in Italy. At the time, you barely knew what Italy was. Still don't really. But he said it with a weight, like it was another world entirely, a place of white buildings and silver towers, where the bread never went stale and the wine was redder than blood. No one believed him. Not really. They all laughed and rolled their eyes, the way people do when they're pretending they're not impressed. Italy, they'd scoff, as if a boy from here could even find the coast. But your uncle never blinked, just said, "He wrote me once," in Latin. Couldn't read a word of it, but the seal was from Rome. You think about that now, years later, as you stand by the old mill, now run by a cousin of the cousin of the cousin of that same boy, who probably never even knew how to sharpen a quill, let alone write a letter. But the tale still lingers, because every village has one, that person who left, who went farther than anyone should, who made it, or died trying. The details blur, but the idea sticks. And maybe, just maybe, it's not entirely made up. You see, millers had a strange kind of power. They weren't quite peasants, not quite gentry. They operated on the edge of both worlds, needed for their skill, tolerated for their independence. The village relied on them, but never entirely trusted them. And that odd space often meant their children were allowed, expected even, to aim higher, to apprentice somewhere new, to travel, to disappear. So it's not impossible that a miller's boy could have joined a religious order, or a merchant caravan, or found work as a scribe's assistant, and from there, well, roads lead somewhere. Even if you start in a place where the pigs outnumber the books, there are documented cases, real ones, of peasants from England, France and the Low Countries ending up across Europe. Some followed their lords into foreign campaigns and stayed. Others were scooped up as choir boys, altar servers, cooks or labourers, and a few had that rare mix of luck, charm and timing. They found their way into city households, learned to read, learned to trade, became someone else entirely. There's one especially odd record from the 14th century of a Flemish peasant who ended up working as a cook in Avignon during the time of the papal court. Avignon, where popes dined under painted ceilings and argued about theology with their mouths full of venison. The peasant didn't last long apparently, got caught stealing dried figs, but the point remains, he got there. This is the fringe fact for the night. Movement could snowball. One trip to a fair could become an apprenticeship in a town. One delivery to a monastery could end with you riding in a merchant's wagon to the coast. And then, a ship, a city, a language you don't understand. Suddenly your name is something foreign in someone else's mouth. And all because one day you walked away from a mill. It's tempting to say these stories were rare, and they were. Most peasants lived and died within 20 miles of their birthplace. But not all, and even one peasant in 1,000 breaking that pattern was enough to plant the seed in everyone else's mind. Because if he made it to Italy, why not you? There's a scholarly dispute about how far these exceptional cases should be used to represent the broader peasant experience. One camp argues that focusing on them distorts the reality of medieval stasis. The other says that without these stories we lose sight of peasant agency, that even in a rigid world individuals carved out astonishing paths. Back in your village the mill's wheel groans with the weight of wet grain, and the air smells like chaff and old wood. A boy about your age is loading sacks into a cart, humming to himself. You ask him if he's ever heard the story about the cousin who went to Italy. He nods without turning. Everyone's got a cousin who went to Italy, he says. Then he glances at you, smirks, and adds, but not everyone's got the guts to try. That night you lie awake and imagine the road. Not the road to the next village, but the big one. The one that twists past towns you've only heard in the mouths of strangers. Rouen, Lyon, Florence. Names that taste like coins and wine and warm bread. You picture walking past olive trees, seeing water so blue it doesn't seem real. Maybe you'd work in a kitchen. Maybe you'd learn to draw, or become one of those people who wear velvet and say clever things at banquets. You know it's a dream, a soft one, the kind that unravels with morning light. But you also know something else. The miller's son left. Maybe not all the way to Italy, maybe not to Rome, but he went somewhere, and that's more than most. So the next time a traveller passes through with strange shoes and a sunburn that smells foreign, you'll ask a question, you'll offer help, you'll listen. Because maybe, just maybe, they've seen something that could change your map. And when they walk away down the long road, you'll feel that tug in your chest again, the one that whispers, it's possible. You could go too. Just one choice, one chance. Even if all you've got is a loaf of bread and the name of a cousin who once wrote from Italy. There's a commotion in the village square today, which is saying something, considering it's usually just chickens and a guy named Osbert yelling about geese that don't belong to him. But this is different. A small cart has arrived, drawn by a patient-looking donkey, and led by a man in a wide-brimmed hat covered in pins and brooches. He's got a crooked grin, a wheezy laugh, and something carefully wrapped in embroidered cloth sitting right at the centre of the cart like it's made of gold. You edge closer, trying to see. Someone near the front whispers reverently, "A relic." That's when you realise what this is. The man steps forward and raises a hand. "Behold," he says, with far too much drama for someone wearing boots with holes in them, "the toe of St. Hadelinus. Blessed be his name, the toe of a saint, right here in your village." A gasp ripples through the crowd, followed by the loud and immediate clunk of someone dropping a coin into the man's little wooden box. You have to admire the commitment. He's got the voice of a preacher and the salesmanship of a peddler. He explains that the relic has travelled from a monastery 200 miles away, and that all who look upon it, or at least pay to, will receive a blessing, mild healing, and possibly more bountiful turnips. And you know what? People believe him. Not because they're foolish, but because they want to. Because life is hard and wet and repetitive, and sometimes the idea that a saint's preserved toe is travelling the countryside giving out miracles is exactly the kind of ridiculous hope you need. Relic tourism, that's the name modern people give to it. But back then, it was just what you did. You make your offering and shuffle forward. The man unwraps the cloth slowly, dramatically, until you're staring at a small yellowed toe bone nestled in velvet. It's grotesque, and also somehow moving. You don't feel any lightning bolt of divine intervention, but there's something about it, something ancient beyond understanding. You nod, step back, and let the next pilgrim come forward. Here's the thing, you wouldn't have had to wait for the relic to come to you. Many people, yes, even peasants, went to the relics. It wasn't just a religious experience, it was an event. Monasteries and cathedrals built entire tourism economies around their sacred bits and pieces. Bones, teeth, skulls, hair, a vial of holy blood that looked suspiciously like old wine. It didn't matter. If people believed it, they would come, and they did. For a peasant, walking to see a relic could be the most significant journey of their life. It might mean 2 days of travel, or 20. You'd sleep in stables, beg food from strangers, and probably get at least one blister that turns into a lifelong scar. But you'd do it, because the soul needed it. Because you heard a miracle happened there once. Because your cousin's back pain hasn't gone away in 5 years, and you'd try anything at this point. Some of these sites were local, saints who died nearby or churches with a special statue. Others became continental destinations. The bones of St. James in Santiago de Compostela drew thousands. The Crown of Thorns in Paris, St. Catherine's Finger in Rouen. Pilgrimage and relic-seeking blurred into one another, and relics moved too. Sometimes by official procession, other times not so officially. Fringe fact of the day, relic theft was a thing. Monks and churchmen would literally sneak into other monasteries and steal relics to bring glory, and crowds, to their own institutions. The most famous example, the monks of St. Denis reportedly stole the bones of St. Benedict from Monte Cassino and paraded them triumphantly through the streets. It was essentially a holy heist, and ironically, it worked. Back in your village, the relic cart stays through evening. The man gives a little sermon under the stars, throws in a few jokes and sells bits of cloth blessed by the toe for half a penny apiece. You watch as people who spent all day groaning about their backs suddenly kneel in the mud, hands clasped. Some of them cry, some just look tired, but everyone walks away a little lighter. That's what travel for relics really was, hope on foot. There's a scholarly debate over how much of this was true belief versus superstition or marketing. Were people genuinely changed by these pilgrimages, or was it just a distraction from hard lives? Some historians argue relics were tools of church control, little more than spiritual carrots. Others say that for peasants, who had no access to books or formal theology, touching a saint's toe was as close to the divine as they could get. And in a world where so much was out of your control, weather, lords, disease, death, that connection mattered. You go to bed that night thinking about the toe, not the bone itself, but the fact that it travelled. That someone, somewhere, wrapped it in velvet and took it on the road. That it crossed rivers and forests and reached you, and maybe one day you'll go to it. Because faith isn't just about belief. Sometimes it's about movement, about stepping outside your village for the first time and walking towards something invisible but powerful, even if that something is shaped like a big toe. The road has no name, no signpost, no neat border that says, "Here begins the rest of the world." It just is. A pale, worn track that snakes out past the manor fields, into the woods, and then on and on, probably to another village, possibly to a market town, maybe even to the sea, if your imagination is feeling bold. You've walked parts of it, maybe 10 miles at most. But beyond that, it disappears into guesswork. Today, though, you're not walking it. You're sitting on a stump near the edge of the field, watching your younger brother point at the horizon and confidently claim that Paris is that way. Which would be impressive if you weren't facing east, and also if he knew what Paris was. He's holding a stick like it's a sword and drawing something in the dirt. Lines, hills, tiny rivers, and what may or may not be a dragon. This is where the king lives, he says, and this is the mountain full of witches. And this here is where you fall off the edge of the world if you keep walking. You laugh, but only a little, because while your brother's drawing looks like a child's fantasy, it's not that far off from how most people in the village imagine the world. See, peasants didn't have maps the way you'd think of them. They didn't grow up with atlases or travel guides, but that doesn't mean they didn't have mental maps, rich, strange, and incredibly detailed in the ways that mattered most. Your world, for example, has edges. You know where the woods begin, where the good path crosses the marsh, where the village with the rude dogs lies. You know the best way to sneak into the lower field when you're avoiding the reeve. You might not know the names of distant cities, but you know places. Medieval peasant geography was practical. It was memory, story, and pattern. You learned from travellers, from gossip, from a cousin who went too far one day chasing a loose pig, and came back with a story about a one-eyed farmer who talked to trees. Directions were given with landmarks, not distances. Take the path past the broken cross where the oak splits into 3. That's how you navigated. Not with a compass, but with breadcrumbs of lived experience. In fact, many people believe peasants were directionless and ignorant of geography. But that's just modern arrogance talking. You didn't need a map drawn in ink when you had a mental one carved by necessity. You knew which villages were friendly and which weren't, where you might find shelter, and where you'd find a pitchfork to the ribs. You didn't know the curvature of the earth, but you could recite every dip and rise in the road between here and the nearest market stall. There's even evidence that peasant oral traditions, songs, folk tales, riddles, served as navigational tools. A ballad might mention a silver river 3 nights wide, and a hill where stars do not shine, which sounds like nonsense until you realise it's describing a moonless path along the marshlands near Hearthwick. In other words, fairy tales doubled as GPS. Still, without formal education, most peasants couldn't draw what they knew. So when churchmen or scribes came around with parchment and ink, asking where one manor began and another ended, the peasantry's contribution was mostly verbal. Well, if you go where the sun touches the field at dusk, turn left at the cursed stump, and walk till your knees ache, that's where their land starts. It's not precise, but it works. And sometimes things get added. You've heard rumours, half fantasy, half hearsay, about distant lands where people wear feathers instead of clothes, or sleep in trees, or eat nothing but apples dipped in gold. Some of these stories come from returning pilgrims, some come from peddlers, some you suspect are completely made up by someone bored on a rainy afternoon. But it doesn't matter. Each story adds a new landmark to the map in your mind, a new maybe. Here's a fringe fact you'll like. There's a surviving 13th century English map called the Guff Map, and while it's astonishingly detailed for its time, it's also weird. Roads connect cities in straight lines, like someone was trying to make a subway diagram with no ruler. Some rivers go the wrong direction. Some towns are clearly oversized because the mapmaker liked them more. And yet, people used it. Not because it was accurate in our modern sense, but because it felt true enough. There's even a scholarly debate about whether most peasants had any concept of the world as a whole. Some argue they lived in deeply local mindsets, unable to comprehend more than a few miles beyond their home. Others counter that just because someone hasn't travelled far doesn't mean they don't imagine far. But peasants, like anyone else, filled in the blank spaces with stories, dreams, and the occasional wildly inaccurate guess. And that brings us back to your brother, now drawing what appears to be a castle on top of a goat. You lean over and ask where the sea is. He jabs his stick in a vague direction. Over there, by the clouds. If you go far enough, there's a boat that takes you to the place where cheese grows on trees. Honestly, sounds nice. You stand and brush dirt off your tunic. The sun is beginning to dip and the air smells like damp hay and chimney smoke. You head back toward the village, following the well-worn path, the one that curves just slightly before the old oak. You know every twist of it, every loose stone and rabbit hole, but you also know it leads out, and in your head, your own map is forming. Not on paper, not with exact scales, but with possibility. You may not know the true shape of the world, but you know enough to start walking. And sometimes that's all a traveller really needs. You're halfway to the river when your left foot disappears into a puddle. Not just a small splash, but a full, boot-swallowing, ankle-chilling plunge into the kind of mud that sucks and slurps like it's trying to pull you down to the centre of the earth. You yank it free with a wet squelch, wobble a bit, and curse in the very specific, colourful way your grandmother always warned you not to. It's spring, which means thawed ground, flooded paths, and the unmistakable return of travel season. Or, as your uncle likes to call it, the annual parade of regret. You're not going far, just to the mill on the other side of the river, but the journey has become an ordeal. Every path is slick, every cart has a wheel that's either cracked or about to crack. The donkey pulling your load of barley clearly hates you and keeps giving you side-eye like this entire situation is your fault. And this is just a short trip. Imagine doing this for 20 miles, 30, in the rain, at night. Medieval travel wasn't glamorous. For peasants it was wet, slow, painful, and deeply humbling. And yet, it happened. Let's talk about how peasants actually got from point A to point B. Spoiler alert, it usually involved feet. 2 of them, blistered and bare more often than not. Most peasants didn't own horses, let alone carriages. Those were for merchants, nobles, or clergy with enough coin and ego to stay above the mud. You walked. Or if you were lucky, hitched a ride on someone else's cart, preferably one that hadn't lost a wheel in the last week. Carts were common but limited. The roads were so bad in many regions that dragging a cart over them felt like a punishment more than a convenience. Dirt tracks, full of ruts and rocks, often turned into rivers after a single rain. And forget signage. If you didn't know the way, you'd better hope someone nearby did. Or that the next traveller you met wasn't drunk, lost, or both. In some places, especially around marshes and river valleys, small boats became the fastest option. If you lived near a navigable waterway, you had access to a kind of peasant highway. Boats could carry goods, people, animals, and gossip much faster than oxen could manage. But rivers came with their own risks, flooding, bandits, and the ever-present possibility of drowning, because someone thought they could row with one oar and a prayer. As for animals, donkeys and mules were the workhorses of peasant travel. Literally. They were cheaper than horses, sturdier, and far less dramatic. A good donkey could walk for days, carrying firewood, cheese, tools, or even the occasional in-law. Oxen were too slow for long distances, and pigs, while portable, were not exactly cooperative companions. There's a reason no one writes heroic epics about pig caravans. Still, you made do. You wrapped your feet in cloth if you had no shoes. You packed bread, dried beans, and maybe a bit of salt pork if you were flush. You carried a knife, not for war but for bread cutting, self-defense, and general life management. And if you had a walking stick, you used it for balance, herding, and occasionally smacking anyone who tried to take your sack of onions. There's a running scholarly debate about whether medieval roads were as horrific as we imagine, or if we've exaggerated their terribleness based on a few dramatic sources. Some historians argue that major routes, those linking big towns or pilgrimage centres, were reasonably maintained, sometimes even paved with stone. Others say that was the exception, not the rule, and that your average rural track was one muddy tantrum away from becoming a swamp. Honestly, both can be true. The route you're on now, it's mostly fine until it isn't. One minute you're strolling along, the next you're knee-deep in something that smells like regret and cabbage. But here's a fringe fact. In some areas, there were travel cooperatives, not official, but understood. Villagers along popular paths would provide shelter or food to travellers in exchange for news, favours, or reciprocal hospitality down the line. It was a kind of community-based travel insurance. Don't rob the guy with the turnips today, and next season his cousin might give you shelter during a thunderstorm. Survival, peasant style. You finally make it to the river crossing, soaked to the knee, barley sack intact. The ferry is just a flat-bottomed boat with a man who looks like he's been yelling at geese since the dawn of time. He grunts, takes your coin, and gestures for you to sit. The crossing is slow but peaceful. You watch the trees lean over the water, their reflections rippling. Somewhere upriver, someone's singing. Badly. Probably drunk. Still, it makes you smile. Travel, you realise, isn't always about grand distances. Sometimes it's just getting to the other side of the river without drowning. Sometimes it's about enduring the 1,000 small indignities of moving through a world not built for ease, but still doing it anyway. And there's something quietly powerful about that. You may not have maps, speed, or comfort, but you have determination. You have legs. You have the wisdom to tie your cloak tight and your bread in oilcloth. And you get there, eventually. You trudge back home at dusk, barley delivered, coins earned. The mud has dried a little, but your feet are sore and your donkey hates you even more than it did this morning. Still, as you crest the hill and see the flickering hearth lights of your village, you feel something like pride. You travelled. You braved the puddles. You didn't get eaten by wolves or robbed by bandits or swept away in a flood. And tomorrow you'll do it again, because that's what peasants did. They kept going, even through the mud. It starts with a low growl in the trees. Not a dog, not quite a bear. Something in between. You freeze mid-step, one hand on the handle of the small rust-blotted knife you keep in your belt, the other clutching your sack of dried peas like it's going to defend you. The growl fades, replaced by the crack of a branch, and then silence. That thick, alert kind of silence that presses against your ears like a held breath. You've made the mistake of travelling after sundown, and now you're off the main road trying to cut through the woods to make it home faster. It was a bad idea. You know that now. The sky's turning that deep purple colour that means real darkness is only minutes away, and the path beneath your feet has turned into a mess of roots and puddles and unseen holes. This is the part of peasant travel people forget. The fear. The very real, very physical dangers of stepping outside your village, especially when the sun is gone and the trees start whispering. Because let's face it, the medieval world was dangerous. Not just mildly inconvenient, not just rustic, but wild. The forest, the hills, even the roads, especially the roads, were full of things that could ruin your day or end your life. And for a peasant without protection, travelling wasn't just tiring, it could be fatal. Bandits were a constant worry. Not the Robin Hood kind with noble causes and great hair, more the desperate, violent, stab first, ask nothing later variety. Sometimes they were ex-soldiers who deserted after a war and decided robbing turnip farmers was more profitable. Sometimes they were just local outlaws who knew where to wait. Narrow passes, thick woods, the edge of town where the guards never look. You could lose your food, your coin, your shoes, or your life. And if it wasn't bandits, it was animals. Wolves were a real concern in much of Europe, especially in the colder months when food was scarce. Bears were rarer but possible. Boars, surprisingly, were worse. Angry, fast, and equipped with tusks that could slice through a man's thigh like a sickle through wheat. You might laugh, but several regions had specific warnings carved into stone markers. Beware of boars. When nature needs signage, you listen. Add to that the weather, torrential rain, unexpected floods, snowdrifts that could swallow a person. Roads turned into rivers. River crossings became death traps. Hypothermia was a concept peasants didn't have a name for, but they knew what it looked like. A curled-up body beside a frozen stream, lips blue, fingers stiff, a half-eaten crust still clutched in one hand. And yet, they travelled. Why? Because they had to. Because the fare was too important, or the monastery too far, or the harvest too short. You didn't travel because it was fun. You travelled because you needed food, money, healing, or sanctuary. And every trip, every single one, was a calculated risk. The church tried to help in its own way. Along major pilgrimage routes, you could sometimes find sanctuary stones, or blessed markers meant to ward off evil and offer guidance. They were more comfort than defence, but sometimes that was enough. Monasteries and abbeys offered shelter to travellers, and some towns employed watchmen who patrolled known trouble spots, though not often, and not very far out. There's a scholarly debate about just how unsafe medieval roads really were. Some argue that the dangers have been overhyped by chroniclers and romantic writers. After all, it's the dramatic stories that get copied down. The merchant robbed in the night, the nun dragged off by outlaws, the pious pilgrim devoured by wolves, or so the story goes. Others argue that we underestimate the daily risks faced by ordinary people on the move. The truth probably lives in between. Most journeys were uneventful, but when they went bad, they went really bad. And here's a strange little fringe detail. In some areas, travellers carried what were known as wolf crosses or beast wards, amulets made from iron, bone or carved wood, often shaped like animals or stars. They weren't officially sanctioned by the church, but people swore by them, wore them around their necks, tied them to carts, buried them at crossroads. If it kept the wolves away, no one asked too many questions. You don't have a wolf cross, you have a stick, and a prayer you're only halfway sure is the right one. You hurry now, feet thudding against the wet ground, eyes wide. You tell yourself that the growl was probably nothing. A badger, a dog, a tree creaking in the wind. But the stories come flooding back. The boy who never came home from the fair, the merchant who showed up in town with one ear missing, the girl whose scarf was found beside the old well, though no one ever found her. You were told these stories to scare you, and it worked. At last you see the flicker of firelight, someone's hearth burning in the distance, a roof, a fence, the smell of smoke and soup. Your feet move faster. You break into a run. You don't stop until you're inside the gate, breath heaving, cloak soaked through, heart hammering like a smith's hammer on iron. No one laughs when they see you pale and panting. No one calls you foolish for being afraid, because they all know. They've all been out there, once or twice when the sun vanished and the woods came alive. That's the hidden part of peasant mobility. Not just that people moved, but that they did it despite the very real fear. That every journey was an act of quiet courage. That every arrival was a small victory. You eat that night with trembling hands. You try to laugh off your panic. But you notice, as you sit by the hearth, that everyone's leaning in a little closer to the fire. No one's looking at the door. No one's talking about what might still be out there, beyond the trees. Because travel wasn't just distance. It was survival. And sometimes the scariest part wasn't where you were going. It was everything you had to pass through to get there. The tavern smells like smoke, spilled ale, and a dozen unwashed men who've all apparently decided that bathing is an annual event. You wedge yourself into a corner near the hearth, half to stay warm and half to stay out of arm's reach of a man loudly insisting he once punched a bishop for cheating at dice. A likely story, but not entirely unbelievable in a place like this. Because taverns, as it turns out, are where the world gets noisy. You came here tonight with your cousin to trade a sack of dried peas for some bread and cheap beer. A simple errand. But now you're sitting with a wooden cup in your hands, surrounded by people from 5 different villages and one who claims to be from across the sea, though he won't say which one. Every time you try to leave, someone starts a new story, or someone stumbles into the room with a bit of news that feels too wild to ignore. This right here is the beating heart of medieval peasant travel. Not the road, not the church, not the market stall, the tavern. Taverns were more than just places to drink, though, let's be honest, that was a major part of their appeal. They were crossroads, bulletin boards, confessionals, the medieval equivalent of a message board, where local life intersected with everything beyond it. You could sit down with someone from 2 valleys over and learn that their village's priest ran off with a merchant's daughter. You could overhear talk of war, Weather, taxes, death, and dinner, all in the same breath. Tonight there's a man bragging that he just returned from a pilgrimage to Canterbury. Says he saw a knight riding a donkey backward as penance for something involving a chicken and a wager. Another man is passing around a coin he swears is from Italy. You think it looks suspiciously like a washer with a hole punched in it, but you let him have his moment. And then there's the woman in the corner, older, hair pulled back with twine, who doesn't talk much but listens to everything. Every now and then she'll mutter a correction, name a town someone mispronounced, or describe a path through the forest that avoids the worst of the marsh. She hasn't left this region in 30 years, but she knows every traveller who comes through. She's like the village archive with wrinkles. There's a scholarly debate about how widespread tavern culture was among the lower classes, especially in rural areas. Some argue that most villages didn't have the population or coin to support a permanent alehouse. Others point to archaeological remains, hearths, barrels, charred bones, and legal records of ale sellers being fined for disorderly behaviour as evidence that informal taverns were everywhere. The likely truth? It varied. But where there were people, there was drink. And where there was drink, there was talk. And let's talk about that talk. In a time before printed pamphlets, before mass communication, word of mouth was king. And it didn't just stay local. News moved with travellers, merchants, friars, peddlers, and yes, drunk farmers who'd wandered too far from home. A tale told in a tavern on Monday might be repeated in a market 50 miles away by Sunday. This is how you learn about things you'd never see with your own eyes. A new tax being imposed by the Crown, a strange illness making its way through the south, a shipwreck off the coast. The rumours change shape with every telling. Details get exaggerated, villains become heroes, and someone always swears they knew the cousin of a friend who saw the whole thing. But the core remains. Peasants knew what was happening in the world, not because they read it, but because they heard it, in rooms just like this. And here's a weird fringe fact for you. In some parts of Europe, taverns were so central to information sharing that town criers and messengers would deliver news inside them first, knowing it would spread faster that way. If you wanted the village to know something, you told the guy with a mug in his hand and a loose tongue. Of course, not everything shared here is harmless. Gossip starts fights, accusations fly, old grudges boil up faster than the stew. At least once a month someone gets dragged out by the collar, and you'll see their face bruised for days after. But even that's part of the ecosystem. The tavern is where the social fabric frays and mends itself, all over a few pints and some very bad music. Tonight, the Reeve gets up on a table to announce something no one asked for. He's halfway through a rant about someone stealing eggs when a traveller interrupts to offer a toast. The Reeve grumbles but lets it happen. The traveller, a thin man with a bent nose and a voice like gravel, tells a story about a town where the snow fell for 10 days straight, and wolves circled the chapel, waiting for the bells to stop. You'd think it was a lie, except he's missing 2 fingers, and his eyes don't blink enough. You're leaning in. You're hooked. And just like that, your world has stretched a little farther. Not physically. You haven't moved. But your mind has. You're imagining the wolves, the snow, the chapel. You're seeing something beyond your own fences. That's what the tavern does. It moves people without moving their feet. It's the meeting point between your life and someone else's, between your truth and someone's exaggeration that might, just maybe, be real. You finally leave near midnight, drunk on stories more than drink. You and your cousin stumble into the cold, the stars shockingly bright. There's laughter behind you, someone singing off key, and the warm, familiar smell of peat smoke clinging to your clothes. As you walk back through the village, you realise something. The tavern isn't just where you hear about travel, it's often where you plan it. Where someone says, "I know a place hiring threshers," or "I heard they need thatchers near the abbey," or even just, "You should come with me next time." And maybe you will. Maybe one of these nights someone will say the right thing, the road will open, and you'll go. But until then you'll be back next week. Same hearth, same bench, different story. Because even for peasants, the road often starts with a rumour and a drink. The morning is crisp, your breath trailing behind you like a fog as you step outside and brace yourself for a day of walking. You're headed to the next village over, 7 miles, give or take, for a bit of trading, maybe a visit with your aunt, and if luck smiles on you, a look at that blacksmith's apprentice everyone's been whispering about since Easter. You've got bread, a packet of dried herbs, a coil of twine, and a hard lump of cheese packed into your satchel, but what you're wearing, that's where the real planning comes in. Because if you're a medieval peasant setting off on the road, you don't just throw on any old tunic. No. Travel means thinking ahead. What's the weather? What's the road like? Will you need to wade through a stream or cross someone's ploughed field? Will you pass through a churchyard, a noble's manor, or a patch of woods known for biting dogs? You reach for your cloak. Coarse wool, brownish grey, stained in at least 4 different shades of questionable. But it's warm and weatherproof. Well, mostly. You pull on your belt and check the loop where your knife hangs. Then you sling your satchel over your shoulder and tuck a bit of cabbage into your pocket. Not for a snack, but to chew on when your jaw gets bored. You'd be amazed how often that happens. Travel clothing for a peasant was never glamorous, but it was strategic. You needed clothes that could take a beating, mud, rain, thorns, sweat, and still be wearable the next day. A tunic long enough to cover your legs but short enough not to trip over. Leg wraps or hose if you were lucky. If you were really lucky, maybe some leather shoes with wooden soles that hadn't cracked yet. Most of the time, you wore what you wore every day, just layered or patched in clever ways. And satchels, essential, usually made from cloth or, if you could manage it, rough leather. They held your food, maybe a spare linen if you were staying overnight, a bit of thread and needle, some herbs for bruises, and a charm. Because you're not an idiot, and the forest doesn't care if you believe in curses or not. It's funny how we picture medieval people looking identical all the time. Sack-like clothing, brown and grey everything, all dressed like extras in a bad history film. But there was variation, even among peasants. Different cuts, different dyes, mostly muted, but some surprisingly vibrant if someone knew their way around Madderroot or Woad. You might pass a woman on the road with a red scarf or a man in blue-stained hose, and that flash of colour meant something. Wealth, maybe, or status, or just an aunt with access to a good dye pot. There's even a fringe theory that some travellers intentionally wore mismatched clothing or odd colours to make themselves appear a bit mad, deterring bandits or overly curious strangers. If someone thought you were half wild, they were less likely to bother you. You don't know if it's true, but you have seen a man in a tunic made of stitched-together sackcloth, one sleeve longer than the other, and a belt fashioned from what looked like a fishing net. No one asked him questions. You walk steadily, the road slowly softening under your boots as the frost melts. Every so often, you see signs that others have passed recently. Footprints, broken twigs, a bit of wool snagged on a fence post. One footprint is bare, which sends a chill down your spine. It's not a good sign when someone's walking barefoot this far from home. Either they've lost everything, or they never had much to begin with. Scholars sometimes argue about whether peasants had designated travel outfits. The general consensus is no. There weren't wardrobes for different occasions when you only owned 2 tunics, and one of them had holes in places you try not to think about. But peasants did prepare, they layered, they packed, they borrowed things when they had to. Travel wasn't glamorous, but it was deliberate, and your clothes weren't just about function. They told a story. That patch on your shoulder, sewn by your sister last winter when the goat bit a chunk out of it. The frayed edge of your cloak, from slipping on a wet log 2 summers ago near the monastery. Every mark, every stitch, every mud stain is part of the record. You wear your road. As the village comes into view, you smooth your hair and adjust your belt. First impressions matter, especially when you're the outsider walking in. You pass a group of children who stare at your boots like they've never seen decent leather. You nod at an old woman spinning wool near the gate. She eyes your cloak, sniffs, and says, "Rain by sundown." You nod again, because she's probably right. You make your trades, some onions for a candle, your herbs for a bit of meat, and spend the rest of the afternoon loitering near the smithy, purely for educational purposes. Then, as the sun starts to dip, you begin the walk back. It's colder now. You wrap your cloak tighter, pull your hood low, and reach for the piece of cabbage in your pocket. It's not exactly a feast, but it'll do. By the time you return home, your boots are soaked through, your left sleeve is mysteriously ripped, and your satchel smells faintly of smoked fish, even though you didn't buy any smoked fish. Travel always changes something, even if you don't notice it right away. And later, when you hang your cloak by the fire, you notice a new tear along the hem. Another mark, another stitch waiting to be sewn, another memory stitched into the fabric of your life. Because even the way peasants dressed when they travelled tells a story. Not one of fashion, but of endurance, of movement, of knowing how to prepare for a road that rarely goes easy on anyone. And cabbage in the pocket? Surprisingly effective. You're leaning on a fence post after chores, staring across the field as the sky goes golden and soft. There's a breeze that smells like crushed grass and chimney smoke, and for once, everything is still, peaceful, predictable, which is, honestly, why you feel so itchy inside your own skin. Because sometimes the sameness of it all, the clink of tools, the squawk of geese, the exact shape of clouds above your village, becomes a kind of cage you can't quite see. You don't hate your life. It feeds you mostly, keeps you warm mostly, but the feeling is still there. The itch, the craving for something else. Even if you don't know what that something is, you start walking. Not for a purpose, no market list, no pilgrimage, no errand from your mother, just walking. The light is soft, the path is empty, and your feet need motion. That's all. And somehow, that's enough. Because sometimes peasants didn't travel for something. Sometimes they just did. They wandered. They looked for views. They followed stories or curiosity or a strange feeling that maybe life wasn't supposed to be confined to 2 muddy fields and a chapel. You've heard people talk about wanderlust, though no one in your village would use that word. They'd just say someone had itchy feet, or a mind like a bird. The miller's daughter, for example. She once followed a fox into the woods and didn't come back until 3 days later, claiming she'd met a hermit who gave her a walnut carved into the shape of a dragon. Your uncle says she was probably drunk. Your cousin says she's mad. But you think she just needed out. There's this idea in modern history that medieval peasants never moved unless forced to. War, famine, marriage, taxes. But there's plenty of quiet evidence that sometimes they just wanted to go. No reason, no plan, just walking, looking, being somewhere else for a while, and there was space for that if you were clever about it. The forest paths were unofficial roads. Not mapped, not monitored, not always safe. But they connected places in ways the official routes didn't. You could follow them to find wild herbs, or secret ponds, or a clearing where some long-gone traveller carved a face into a tree trunk. You could walk until the sounds of your village faded, and the only noise was birdsong and the distant call of deer. In those moments, you weren't a villain, or a daughter, or a tenant. You were just a body with feet and a direction. Of course, you didn't always come back with treasure. Sometimes you came back with blisters or thorns in your cloak, or a cold that lasted 3 weeks. But there were days, just a few, when you found something strange. A circle of mushrooms, a carved stone, a hill where the air felt wrong in your lungs but beautiful in your ears. Something that felt older than you, deeper than the fields. There's a fringe account, half folklore, half buried in a forgotten parish register, about a boy who walked all the way from a village near York to the cliffs of Dover just because someone told him you could see France on a clear day. He left with nothing but a walking stick and a pack of bread. Took him 3 weeks. When he came back, he said the sea looked like a god with its eyes closed. Then he became a baker. Didn't change the world. But he went. Wandering like this wasn't always admired. Some people thought it meant idleness. If you've got time to roam, you've got time to thresh, the reeve once snapped at your cousin, who had the audacity to follow a rainbow across 2 fields and came back with stories about a village with blue chickens. But there were others, quiet ones, who nodded, who understood, who remembered the time they walked just to walk. Scholars tend to lump all peasant movement under migration, or mobility, as if every step had to have a socio-economic function. But there's a growing debate, mostly among younger historians, about whether we're overlooking the emotional, even spiritual side of travel. That maybe not everything was survival or transaction. Maybe peasants had inner lives complex enough to want beauty, stillness, the unknown. You pause on a hill now, the sky melting into pink and violet. In the distance, you see smoke rising from a village you've never visited. You could keep walking. It would be easy. The road is open. The breeze is kind. Your feet feel strong, but you don't. Not tonight. You turn back. Not because you must, but because there's a stew waiting and a dog that always howls if you're late. But something has shifted. The path is yours now. You know you can walk it again. Further. Longer. You know there's nothing stopping you but time and weather. And that's the quiet truth. Peasants could be travellers, even if they didn't pack bags or get fancy titles for it. Even if they just walked to the next rise, looked out, breathed deeply, and came back with pockets full of leaves. You reach the village as the first stars appear. No one notices your absence. No one asks where you've been. And that's fine. Some journeys aren't for telling. They're just for feeling. So next time someone says medieval peasants never saw beyond their fields, remember this. The road doesn't care who you are. It doesn't ask for permits. It just stretches forward. And sometimes you follow it, not to escape or survive or sell, but simply to see. The scribe arrives at noon with a scroll in one hand and a donkey in the other. He's wearing a too-short cloak that flaps as he walks, and a hat that would be impressive if it weren't wilting under the weight of the sun. His boots are cracked, his fingers ink-stained, and his expression has the same kind of worn patience as your grandfather's ox. Everyone stops what they're doing when he shows up, because no one, not the reeve, not even the priest, walks around with an official-looking scroll unless something unpleasant is about to happen. And today is no exception. By royal ordinance, the scribe announces, his voice hoarse from road dust and probably regret, all tenants of this manor are henceforth required to provide 2 days of labour per household for the construction of the new bridge at Greystone Ford. A groan ripples through the crowd like wind through wheat. Greystone is 12 miles away, 4 hours on foot, longer if it rains. You glance around and see the same expression on every face. That tight, silent calculation of how much work you'll miss, how much food you'll need to carry, and whether your boots will survive the trip. Because sometimes peasants didn't travel by choice. Sometimes they were moved by law, by crown, by church. Whether for bridges, ditches, roads, or royal whims, the command came from above, and your feet were expected to obey. This was called corvée labour, one of the many delightful obligations baked into medieval peasant life. A fancy term for congratulations, your back belongs to someone else now. Lords, kings, abbots, they all had projects, and they didn't pay for labour when they could just demand it instead. So next week, you and half the village will pack tools, food, and whatever scraps of patience remain, and trudge down the long, puddle-ridden track to Greystone Ford. You'll clear brush, move stones, dig foundations, all under the supervision of someone who probably hasn't touched a shovel in his life. But here's the thing, even forced travel is travel. You leave your home, you see new faces, you learn new curses, and if you're lucky, you trade gossip with a stranger who knows where the roads are smoothest or where bread costs the least. When you arrive at Greystone, the scene is controlled chaos. Dozens of peasants from different villages have been summoned for the same task. The air smells of wet wood, sweat, and the vague hopelessness of state-funded infrastructure. Everyone has a job, hauling, hammering, cutting. You're assigned to stone carrying, of course. But in the evenings, when the tools are down and the sun is low, something strange happens. People talk. They sit around fires and swap stories, trade food, ask questions. Where are you from? What's your lord like? Did the plague hit your village last year? Know anyone in Harthwick? Is it true there's a talking bird living in the bishop's tower? This is where the human side of peasant travel shines. Even under pressure, even in forced labour, there's connection. Networks. Tiny sparks of shared knowledge lighting up between people who, on paper, are supposed to live and die in isolation. You meet a girl from 2 manors over who tells you about a place where the landlord only demands 2 chickens a year in rent. Another boy brags about a secret market that opens before dawn in the woods. Someone else tells you how to waterproof your boots using sheep tallow and prayer. You don't know if any of it's true, but it doesn't matter. Your world is expanding anyway. There's a scholarly argument, because of course there is, about whether corvée labour should count as meaningful peasant movement. Some say it doesn't, because it wasn't voluntary, and because peasants were expected to return home right after. Others argue that it absolutely counts, because it created opportunities for exposure, learning, and even escape. Plenty of people didn't return. Not immediately, not ever. Some slipped away during multi-day projects, vanishing into nearby towns or wandering off along a different road entirely. And there's evidence, real, archival stuff, that some lords hated corvée labour because it encouraged mobility. Too many peasants coming into contact with other ideas, other systems, too much sharing, too much awareness. It undermined the illusion that everyone lived in their own little pocket, content with their lot. Here's your fringe fact for the evening. In 13th century France, a peasant named Hugo of Vercy was sent to repair a royal road, got injured, stayed behind to recover, and ended up working at a roadside inn. 10 years later, his name appears in city tax records as a full citizen. He never returned to his manor. Apparently he made excellent barley stew and kept a very clean broom, mobility by shovel. Back at Greystone, the bridge is coming together, slowly. You're tired, sore, and vaguely annoyed that the scribe who delivered the order hasn't lifted a single stone. But still, you're grateful. You've met people, learned things, seen a part of the world you wouldn't have otherwise, and when the bridge is done, when you finally walk back home, feet blistered and cloak caked in dust, you'll bring that experience with you. People will ask what it was like. You'll complain, obviously. But deep down, you'll remember the way the river glowed at sunset. The song someone sang about a girl who turned into a hawk. The taste of that odd spiced porridge from the man with 3 teeth and no sense of personal space. Because even when the journey is forced, the experience is yours. And tomorrow, when another scroll arrives and another road must be built, you'll know. The king may command your labour, but the road still offers something back. Even if it's just a new way to lace your boots. It starts with a story. You're 10 years old, lying in bed next to your little sister, both of you pretending to sleep as your grandmother sits by the fire, spinning wool and telling tales you're not supposed to hear. She's talking about a village that once vanished overnight. Poof, gone. Just smoke where houses had been, and a trail of silver coins leading into the woods. She swears it happened during her mother's time, and that it was the result of a cursed relic or a deal with the devil, or a saint's disapproval, depending on which version she's telling that night. You close your eyes and imagine it. People creeping into the trees under a red moon, abandoning their fields, chasing a voice only they could hear. It sounds terrifying and exhilarating. That's your first lesson in travel, not maps, not measurements, but stories. Local legends passed from mouth to mouth, shaping your sense of what's out there, not by fact, but by feeling. Because long before you ever leave the village, your imagination already has. It's easy to think that medieval peasants lived in small, claustrophobic mental worlds, with no sense of what lay beyond the next hill. But that's not quite right. They had narratives, tales of saints and sinners, dragons and ghosts, miracles and disasters. Their world was stitched together by stories, some rooted in truth, others tangled in superstition, and those stories pointed outward, toward the unknown. You hear one about a castle with invisible walls somewhere in the north, where people eat with silver forks and ride horses that breathe fire. Another about a giant who guards a bridge to a forgotten town, and if you guess his name, he gives you a loaf of bread that never runs out. And then there's the tale of the girl who ran away with a travelling magician and came back 20 years later, not a day older, carrying a harp that only plays at night. You know these aren't real, or maybe you don't, but they feed something inside you. Something restless, wild, curious. Your uncle tells you that when he was a boy, he walked 2 days to a town where a man could juggle knives while riding a goat. Your mother rolls her eyes. Your uncle swears on his favourite hat. Somewhere in between the scoffing and the swearing lies a deeper truth. People want to believe in other places. They want wonder, and wonder is a map of its own kind. Even now you catch yourself watching the horizon differently, not just with your eyes, but with your mind. You think of the old oak tree that marks the edge of your manor. Beyond it lies another village. Beyond that, a river. And somewhere, maybe the sea. You've never seen it. But the way people describe it, with awe and a tinge of fear, makes it feel as real as anything you've ever touched. There's a scholarly term for this, mental mapping. It means the internal geography you build based on memory, hearsay, and experience. And for medieval peasants, it was built less from roads and more from narratives. You might not know the distance between Paris and London, but you know that between here and the old stone cross, the spirits of plague victims roam at dusk. That if you pass the third standing stone and walk west, there's a house no one enters twice. That the wind changes direction near the abbey ruins, and nobody knows why. These mental maps weren't just spooky bedtime material, they shaped travel decisions. You avoided paths that were said to be cursed. You chose villages with reputations for hospitality. You walked longer if it meant bypassing the haunted mill where someone once heard crying from a well. And it wasn't all fear. Some stories invited you to move. There were tales of holy springs that healed rashes, of trees that whispered prophecies, of distant fields where the wheat grew taller than a man. A cousin might leave for one of these places chasing a vision. A peddler might arrive claiming he's seen it. Truth, myth, didn't matter. What mattered was that your world expanded every time someone said it did. Here's a fringe fact that proves just how much stories mattered. In parts of medieval Europe, some villages were known by reputation more than location. There are records of people saying things like, "He went toward the village where the statue of the Virgin cried blood," or "She fled to the town where chickens laid blue eggs." No one seemed too fussed if the statue actually cried, or if the eggs were blue. The story was enough to point the way. In this way, folklore was a compass. A weird, wobbly one, sure, but a compass nonetheless. There's even a debate among historians about how much folklore shaped medieval peasant migration. Some argue it was mostly practical concerns: land, labour, taxes. Others believe stories played a quiet but powerful role, nudging people toward hope or away from fear. A village with a tale of prosperity and blessing might draw strangers. One with a history of hauntings might stay small forever. The map wasn't just about roads, it was about reputation. You find yourself thinking about that tonight, sitting outside with a warm mug, listening to the wind move through the trees. You remember the tale of the silent village, one where no one speaks because once a lie broke the sun. Your cousin says it's real. You know it isn't. But part of you wants it to be. Because the stories make the world feel bigger. And when you do eventually travel, on your own feet with your own pack, you'll carry those stories like breadcrumbs, markers of where not to go or maybe where you must. You'll listen for the signs, the whispering pines, the shape of a cloud, the name of a field that shouldn't be spoken aloud. Not every journey begins with need. Some begin with wonder. And wonder for a medieval peasant was as powerful as any map. You don't notice the stranger at first. He's just another tired figure by the village well, cloak pulled tight, face shadowed beneath a weather-stained hood. You're more focused on your aching shoulders and the fact that the bucket rope keeps jamming. But then he speaks, asks where the nearest church is, and it hits you. That accent. Not yours, not even close. It's not just the words he uses, but how they land. Rounder vowels, clipped consonants, a strange melody to the sentence. You blink, realise you've been staring, and stammer something vaguely helpful. The man thanks you and shuffles off, leaving behind a silence thicker than it should be. That's when it happens, that little tilt of the world, the moment you realise he came from somewhere else, a place where people sound different, think different, maybe even are different. And suddenly, the village feels smaller than it did 5 minutes ago. It's not the first time you've heard an unfamiliar voice. Travellers come through sometimes. Pilgrims, monks, tax collectors, traders. But each one is like a reminder stamped into your day. The world is wide and your tongue is only one dialect among dozens. Language in the medieval world was messy. There was no standard version of anything, least of all how people spoke. Even within a 20-mile radius, dialects could shift dramatically. One village might say bread, another says broad, and someone in the next valley calls it rude and swears that's how it's been since God made wheat. You all understand each other mostly. But there are moments, deliciously awkward moments, where meaning slides sideways and no one's quite sure who just agreed to what. You remember the time your cousin went to a fair in another county and came back furious because he thought he'd traded for a goat and instead received a cart full of turnips. Apparently the word gort meant root vegetable where he was. He still complains about it. But miscommunication wasn't just about comedy. It was part of what made peasant travel both exciting and dangerous. Say the wrong word in the wrong place, and you might end up offending someone, or making a promise you didn't mean, or looking like an outsider in a way that drew unwanted attention. And for many peasants, being marked as not from here wasn't a neutral thing. It could get you overcharged at a market, questioned by the reeve, or even accused of stealing if a chicken went missing on the wrong day. Strangers were fascinating, yes, but they were also suspect. Still, language also built bridges. If you listened carefully, if you picked up a few words here and there, you could move between communities with more ease than most. That's why older travellers often had a strange mix of dialects woven into their speech, part song, part patchwork, and you'd hear them switch mid-sentence depending on who they were talking to. It was a kind of verbal survival instinct. There's even a scholarly debate about how mobile dialects were, whether they stayed tightly locked to one region or drifted with travellers. Some argue that wandering minstrels and seasonal workers acted as linguistic bridges, carrying turns of phrase like seeds, dropping them across counties and watching new words sprout. Others claim peasants clung tightly to their own speech patterns, seeing change as something suspicious or unnecessary. But language did move. Slowly, unevenly, but it moved. Here's your fringe fact of the night. In a few surviving court records from medieval England, translators were required, not for Latin, but for English. The local dialect was so thick and the visiting party's accent so foreign that a go-between had to stand there and essentially interpret English into English. Imagine trying to explain to a judge that, yes, you did say something rude, but not that rude. You return to your chores that afternoon with the stranger's voice still echoing in your head. Later you'll ask Father Odo where the man came from, and he'll say something vague like, the south, or near the river towns, which is basically a shrug in words. The man is gone by morning, and you'll never see him again. But he leaves a kind of mark, one of those invisible shifts that you can't explain, only feel. It's not just language, it's identity, accent, tone, phrasing. It all tells people where you're from, who you are, whether you're safe, whether you belong. And every time you speak in a new place, you gamble a little. You reveal yourself. But there's another side to it. You also learn. You listen. You adapt. Your cousin, the one who traded for turnips instead of a goat, ended up marrying a girl from that same village. Now he says rude too. That's how it goes. Words travel. People follow. You start paying more attention now when travellers speak. You notice the way they shape their vowels, the names they use for things you've always called something else. It's not just curiosity, it's strategy. If you ever go farther than your familiar fields, you'll need to speak in a way that keeps you safe, or at least fed. And who knows? Maybe one day you'll be the stranger by someone else's well, asking directions, watching someone's eyes widen at the way you say milk or roof or field. Maybe you'll laugh and explain, or maybe you'll keep walking, letting them puzzle over you after you're gone. Because in the world of the peasant traveller, language isn't just communication. It's a marker, a tool, a test, and sometimes a door. When you first see him walking down the road, you don't recognise him. The beard is new, so is the limp. He carries himself differently now, less like someone who belongs to a place, and more like someone who's walked away from several. His cloak is patched in at least 4 colours, his boots are scuffed past salvation, and there's a kind of tired pride in the way he holds his pack across his shoulders. It's only when he draws close, and someone shouts his name, twice before it registers, that you realise it's your cousin Mathis. Gone 2 years, maybe more. Everyone thought he was dead, but here he is, dusty and alive, with a grin that's half apology and half, "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." He doesn't offer many details, not at first, just says he was working, travelling, finding things out, which could mean anything, could mean everything. You don't press him. Instead you sit and listen as he peels off layer after layer of road grime and lets the stories spill out like loose grain. He's been to 4 towns, 3 fairs, 1 abbey, and a port village where the wind stank of fish and the women swore like sailors. He worked on a merchant's barge for a while, loading crates and sleeping on sacks of barley. He nearly got arrested in a market brawl that wasn't his fault. He saw the sea, and yes, it is as big as they say. You listen, wide-eyed, half in awe and half trying to imagine yourself doing the same. Not because you doubt him, but because you've changed too. And part of you wonders, if he hadn't come back, would you have recognised who he became? That's what travel does. It doesn't just stretch your legs, it stretches your sense of self. And when a peasant leaves the village, whether for a year, a season, or just long enough to taste another life, they come back different. Not always visibly, but fundamentally. Mathis walks like a man who knows how to sleep anywhere. He eats slower now, savouring each bite like it might be the last decent meal he sees for a while. He has opinions, loud ones, about salt, shoemakers, and the price of cider in towns you've never heard of. But more than that, he sees things differently. He watches people carefully. He asks strange questions, and when you joke about the Reeve being stingy with grain rations, he just laughs and says, "You think he's bad? You should have met the steward in Alderbrook. Re-entry isn't always easy." His mother sobs with relief, then scolds him for not writing, until he reminds her he never learned how. The Reeve asks where he's been and raises an eyebrow when Mathis shrugs. Some villagers are thrilled to see him. Others mutter about unreliable men, and whether he's come back with disease, trouble, or worse, ideas. And he has brought ideas. Ideas about towns where peasants get paid for extra work, about markets where the Lord's men don't take a cut of everything, about women who own their own shops and schools that teach boys who aren't noble, ideas that make people lean in or lean away, because a travelling peasant brings more than stories. They bring change. There's a scholarly debate about how often peasants really return to their home villages after extended travel. Some argue that most did, that the village was still home, still safer, still theirs. Others point out that once someone saw a broader world, they often stayed in it, becoming town labourers, monks, even soldiers. But those who did return, they became bridges. Between the closed world of the manor and the shifting one beyond, Mathis is that now. A bridge. A reminder that life doesn't have to be one plough, one harvest, one cold winter after another. He teaches your youngest brother how to mend a sandal with a bit of wire he picked up from a cooper in the south. He helps your mother build a better smokehouse, because he saw one shaped like a dome in a mountain village and swears it traps heat better. He even draws, badly, what he remembers of a windmill that turned sideways instead of up. No one believes it would work, but they remember it anyway, and slowly, over days and weeks, your village absorbs him again. Not fully. He'll always be a little different now, but his stories become part of the rhythm, his presence, proof that leaving doesn't mean forgetting, or vanishing. One night, sitting by the fire, he tells you something he hasn't told anyone else. "I almost didn't come back," he says quietly. "Not because I didn't want to. Just because I didn't know if I still fit here." You understand that more than you say. There's a fringe tale you remember from a wandering priest who passed through once, about a woman who went on pilgrimage, found a job in a cathedral town, and when she returned home years later, her own brother didn't recognise her. She'd changed her clothes, her speech, even her name. He turned her away at the door. She left without a word and no one ever saw her again. Maybe it was just a cautionary tale, or maybe it was a warning. Travel changes you, and the place you left might not change with you. But Mathis came back, and your village, in its own slow, muddy way, let him. Now you watch him helping repair the grain store roof, arguing with the reeve, laughing with the baker's daughter. He still limps, still flinches in his sleep sometimes, but he's here. And in every story he tells, every tool he teaches someone to use, you hear a quiet truth. You can leave and still return. You can see the world and still come home. But you won't come back the same, and that's the point. There are shoes by the door, small ones, worn at the toes and stained from weeks of rain. They belong to a girl named Elsbeth, who hasn't come home. She left before sunrise 5 days ago with a bundle of dried beans, a cracked mug, and the promise of work in a weaving house 2 villages away. She said she'd be back after the festival. That was the plan. Her mother swore it was only a short trip. Her brothers teased her about marrying a stranger and never returning. She rolled her eyes, laughed, and waved them off. Now her shoes sit untouched, and her name hangs in the air like the echo of a bell that stopped ringing but won't quite fade. Disappearance in a medieval village is a quiet kind of grief. There are no missing person posters, no search parties, just the long wait at the gate, just the space where someone was. When a peasant vanishes, it's not always a tragedy, not at first. Sometimes it's just a detour, a delay, maybe a longer job, maybe rain flooded the road, maybe she lost her way, or stopped to help a sick pilgrim. There are always maybes, until there aren't. This is the unspoken risk of peasant travel, the ones who don't come back. You'd think the biggest danger was wolves or plague or being robbed by desperate men in a ditch. And yes, those things do happen, but often the truth is simpler. People leave, and sometimes they choose not to return. The village talks, they always do. Some say Elsbeth found better work, others whisper that she ran off with a cooper, or maybe joined a group of pilgrims heading to Canterbury. There's even a theory that she took up with a travelling acting troupe. That one comes from your cousin, who read it in a songbook and now thinks all theatre people wear feathers and drink wine for breakfast. But not everyone thinks she left willingly. There's always the darker possibility, that she was taken, tricked, sold, that someone offered her a warm bed and then locked the door behind her. These stories aren't just cautionary, they're real. Peasant women, especially young ones travelling alone, walked a thin line between independence and danger. A single road, a single wrong turn, and the world could turn sharp. Still, most people assume she made her choice. Because that's the part nobody likes to say aloud. Some people don't want to come back, and who can blame them? Maybe they were tired of the fields, of the same 3 meals, of the same voices. Maybe they dreamed of roofs that didn't leak and of waking up without the weight of chores pressing down before dawn. Maybe they just wanted to disappear into the noise of a city or the silence of a monastery. And maybe, just maybe, they did. It's not common. Most peasants returned. Home meant food, shelter, familiar faces. But the ones who left for good, they became stories, warnings, myths. You remember old Tom, who still talks about his brother who vanished during a pilgrimage? Swears he was taken in by monks and now brews ale for royalty. Never mind that no one's ever heard from him. Or Miller, who once claimed she met a woman in the woods who used to be a dairymaid and now lives with wolves. Was she joking? Probably. But no one asked twice. And there are the sadder stories too. A girl who went to visit her aunt and was found months later, starved, alone, raving about a demon in a red hood. A boy who chased a deer too far and was buried under leaves by accident or intention. No one ever figured out which. Scholars argue over how often this kind of disappearance actually happened. Some think the records exaggerate, turning every runaway into a tragedy, every traveller into a ghost. Others insist we underestimate the sheer number of people who walked off and were never seen again. After all, without centralised tracking, a peasant could vanish 10 miles away and live a whole new life. And here's your fringe fact. In some medieval records, there's evidence of entire households reappearing in unexpected places under new names. Whole families uprooted, changed their story, and pretended to be from somewhere else entirely. Why? To escape taxes, or war, or maybe just to start over. Imagine that, slipping out under cover of night and waking up tomorrow as someone new. The idea thrills you, in a quiet, unsettling way. Not because you want to vanish, but because you now understand that it's possible, that not every traveller comes back because not every traveller should. As evening falls, Elsbeth's mother lights a candle and sets it in the window. It's a silent hope, a beacon. Maybe she'll see it. Maybe she's close. Maybe she just got caught in the rain. But you can't help noticing that the candle gets smaller every night. You walk past her shoes again on your way home. They're still there, unmoved. You wonder if someone should put them away, or if leaving them out is the only way to admit she might still return. And you think about how many peasants have walked away from places like this, some chased by need, some drawn by promise, some just pulled by something they couldn't name. You think about the courage it takes to leave, and the courage it takes to come back. Not everyone does both. Some roads are one way, some shoes stay empty. The first time you see him, he's sitting on the edge of a fountain, eating something that might be bread or might be cheese, or might be both, depending on how long it's been out in the sun. He's dressed simply, like a farmer or a mason, with a worn cloak and dusty boots. Nothing fancy. No sword, no shining badge, no gold thread. But he's surrounded by 3 boys and a girl who won't stop staring at his hands, and he's talking about something that sounds suspiciously like a giant squid. You listen for a moment. He's describing a port city in Spain where the air smells like garlic and salt, and the sun shines on marble courtyards. He's been to Paris too, and claims he once saw the Pope ride by on a white horse. The children gasp, one clap, another doesn't believe him, and he just laughs and shrugs like it doesn't matter whether you believe it, it still happened. Eventually someone asks him who he really is. A merchant? A monk? A thief? He grins and says, "Just a peasant, like you." And that's when it hits you. He's not lying. He is a peasant. Born in a village no bigger than yours. Used to herd sheep. Barely learned to write. No noble blood. No silver spoon. Just a man with sore feet and a mind like an open road. There's a quiet truth hidden here. One that doesn't show up in most history books. Some medieval peasants travelled farther than nobles ever did. Not because they were sent on embassies or crusades, but because they had to. Because opportunity, work, survival, all of it demanded movement. And sometimes, just sometimes, they found themselves on paths that led farther than anyone expected. Take, for example, the story of Isambard, a peasant from Normandy in the 12th century. He began life as a ditch digger, ordinary, invisible. But over time, he joined a merchant caravan as a labourer, learned some Latin from a travelling monk, and eventually found himself in Constantinople working as a porter near the docks. His name appears in 3 different city ledgers. He died owning more boots than most peasants had ever seen. Or the case of Maria of Lübeck, a linen spinner who followed a pilgrimage route south and ended up in Rome. where she worked in a tavern for over a decade and sent coin back to her family every harvest season. She never came home, but her letters did, carried by friars and traders and anyone with a pocket and a decent sense of direction. Nobles, on the other hand. Many of them didn't travel far. Some never left their own lands, managing estates and fighting small wars within 50 miles of where they were born. Why would they leave? Everything they wanted, comfort, power, food, walls, was right there. But peasants? They didn't have anchors. They had motives, seasonal work, famine, opportunity, fairs, festivals, healing springs, long-lost cousins, or just the knowledge that someone in a nearby town needed hands and had coin. They followed rumours like maps. There's a growing scholarly conversation about this, how we've traditionally underestimated peasant mobility. Not just mobility in the social sense, but literal movement. The kind of physical, dusty, footsore travel that leaves your knees aching and your skin sunburnt. Records are sparse because no one wrote poems about peasant wanderers, but they left traces, unexpected burial sites, name mismatches in tithing rolls, spindle whirls in cities where no one remembers the weavers arriving. People moved, a lot more than we once thought, and here's a little fringe detail for your collection. Some peasant travellers kept journals. Not often, and rarely well written, but they existed. Scraps of parchment tucked into satchels or passed to monks for copying. A few have survived. Lists of places, descriptions of meals. One includes a drawing of a particularly ugly donkey with the note, "He bit me and ate half my bread." I named him Satan, a crude kind of travel blog, but genuine. Back at the fountain, the peasant traveller stands, brushing crumbs off his tunic. The children beg for one more story. He gives them a quick one, about a cat that survived a shipwreck, lived in a monastery, and was later elected mayor of a small town. Almost certainly made up, but they love it. As he walks away, someone asks him if he's going home. He pauses, looks out over the rooftops and says, "Not yet." There's always something else to see. And that stays with you, because this man, who wears no seal, bears no title, has seen more than your Lord ever will. He's walked into cities with gates higher than church towers, heard sermons in languages he didn't know existed, slept under olive trees, eaten food so spicy he cried. He's been poor the entire time. His hands are blistered, his knees creak, and half his teeth are gone. But he's seen the world. It makes you rethink what it means to be lowborn. If travel is knowledge, and knowledge is power, then maybe, just maybe, the world is a little more upside down than people say. Because the road doesn't care about titles. It doesn't ask for lineage or coins. It asks for feet, for grit, for a willingness to keep walking even when the weather turns. And in that sense, peasants, those forgotten, underestimated, undershoed travellers, may have been the most worldly people of all. You sit a while longer after he's gone, watching the road where he disappeared, and you wonder if maybe it's your turn next. The wind picks up just as you pass the old hollow tree, the one that creaks like it's got secrets. You know the path well, stones, mud, a sharp bend near the blackberry bushes, but today it feels different, not because of anything you see, but because of what you know. You've walked every kind of road by now, travelled for fairs, feasts, prayer, war and work. You've been soaked through, sunburnt, frozen stiff, and stared at by people who thought your accent meant outsider, and still your feet move forward, because they always have. Tonight you're heading home from the next manor over, where you'd been helping harvest apples and replace a collapsed barn roof. Not glamorous, but decent coin and even better company. 2 cousins, a reeve with a sense of humour, and a cook who swore by lard and sage in everything, including the cider. You stayed longer than planned, but they didn't mind, and neither did you. It's late now, and the path is quiet. But as you walk, your mind drifts, not just to the day, but to everything you've seen over the years. And here it is, finally. The truth no one ever told you when you were young and thought the world ended at the churchyard. Peasants travelled, not all, not always, not easily. But more than the myths would have you believe, the idea that they were tied to their village like a chicken to a post, that they never saw beyond their own fields, that's comfortable fiction, easy to teach, easy to believe. But it's not the whole story. You know, now that peasants walked, they wandered, they got drafted, married, chased, hired, blessed, cursed, or simply curious enough to go. Some returned, some didn't, some got lost. Others found themselves 100 miles from home, staring up at a cathedral so big it made their knees wobble, and they made maps, not on parchment, but in memory, in songs, in stories, in warnings passed from mouth to mouth at firesides and inns. Don't trust the baker in Titchwell, his scales lie. Take the left fork after the elm tree if it's been raining. There's a widow in Rooksby who will feed you if you chop wood. They created a network of experience sewn together not by kings or scholars, but by common folk with aching feet and open eyes. You think about the festivals you've walked to, fields full of colour and smoke, acrobats flipping in the dust, peddlers shouting in 5 languages at once. You remember the path to the abbey, the hours spent walking just to see a fragment of saintly bone and the oddly calming voice of a monk who told you miracles didn't always look like lightning. You remember the war, the draft, the silent march with 2 heavy armour, and the night you laid under the stars and realised you missed the sound of your village dog barking at nothing. You think about the time your friend got lost for 2 days and came back convinced he'd seen a ghost, or maybe a knight. Hard to say. You remember the runaway miller's daughter, the wandering tailor, the tinker with a pet goose that wore a red ribbon, and all the inns, the crossroads, the footpaths that aren't marked on any official map but are realer than any road a noble has ever ridden. Because this wasn't rare, this wasn't extraordinary, this was normal, just quieter, less recorded, scratched into dirt instead of ink. There's still debate in the world of scholars. Oh, how they debate. Was peasant mobility high or low? Were manorial laws enforced strictly or loosely? Was freedom of movement the exception or the rule? The records are murky, the answers slippery, but the evidence whispers from every direction. Footprints across borders, familiar names in foreign towns, relics found far from origin, and the same kind of woven basket showing up hundreds of miles apart. The modern myth says peasants were static, stuck, closed in. The truth is more complicated, and far more human. Here's one last fringe fact to leave you with. In a 14th century village ledger, a serf named Alaric paid a small fee to his lord, not to be freed entirely, but to be allowed to follow the road where it called. That's how it was written, where it called. No explanation, no destination, just the recognition that sometimes a person needs to go. You step around a puddle, the moonlight catching the water just right, and it feels like a little portal. Maybe it is, maybe every road is, and the thing is, you're not alone. You've never been. Every traveller who's come before you, whether barefoot pilgrim, runaway apprentice, curious farmer, or war-weary spinner, has left something behind. A breath on the wind, a scuff in the earth, a story passed on. Now, as you come over the final hill and see the glow of home in the distance, you know this. The road is part of you. Not just where it goes, but what it means. Freedom, risk, possibility. Even now you feel the tug of other roads, not taken yet, not forgotten, just waiting. Because peasants didn't just walk. They wandered, and when they came back, if they came back, they carried more than dust. They carried stories. So now you're home, feet sore, mind humming, and maybe, just maybe, your view of the medieval world feels a little wider. The fire is low, the night's grown quiet, and the old myth has cracked. Peasants weren't just soil-bound shadows in some gloomy village, doomed to how the same row of turnips forever. They walked, they travelled, they dared to move, not just for kings or crusades, but for love, for fear, for coin, for curiosity. You've seen them on the road to a market, crouched beside a relic cart, arguing over bread prices in a fairground, whispering ghost stories at a tavern. You've walked in their shoes, dusty, patched, sometimes barefoot, but always moving. You've felt the pull of the unknown, the risk of leaving, and the quiet thrill of coming back changed. And maybe the biggest truth of all, they weren't all that different from you, because even now, centuries later, we're still wanderers at heart, still chasing stories, still asking what lies beyond the next bend in the road, still hungry for something new, even when we don't know quite what it is. So if you ever feel stuck, hemmed in by routine or expectation, remember this: your ancestors walked, farther than you'd guess, with less than you'd want, for reasons more human than history ever gave them credit for. And they didn't ask permission. The world is bigger than your doorstep, it always has been. Now, take a slow breath. Feel your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench. The journey's done for now. You've walked through centuries tonight, met travellers and saints, rebels and dreamers. You've learned how they dressed, how they ate, what scared them, and what pulled them forward. Let the weight of their stories settle gently across you. Let it soothe you. Let it remind you that movement is natural, that staying and going both carry meaning, and that your story, like theirs, is still unfolding. Sleep well, traveller.